Hey everyone, this is part one of Antonio Carlo's piece, The Socio-Economic Nature of the USSR. Part one is titled The Theoretical Debate on the Nature of the USSR. Section one of part one is titled Introduction. The problem of the social character of the USSR and of its economic structures was the subject of intense debate during the 1930s. Today it is becoming all the more actual within the context of the Sino-Soviet split and the power politics of the USSR. Note that this was originally published in Italian in 1971. Thus it is necessary to proceed to a historical analysis of the present and past roots of Soviet degeneration, keeping in mind that on this problem there has been a great theoretical lacuna. Even the Chinese position, which grasps precisely the class nature and non-socialist character of the USSR, is occasionally rather schematic and reticent, especially on the Stalinist phase. Footnote. On this point see the Chinese thesis expressed in Le Question di Stalin in Quaderni delle Edizioni Oriente 5. The oscillating character of the Chinese position was recently discussed by Calotti and Pischel. End footnote. It often oscillates between asserting that capitalism is being restored in Russia and that capitalism has already been restored, something quite different. Footnote. On this point, see La base sociale del revisionismo in Lavoro Politica 2 and Il revisionismo in USSR. I don't know. I probably shouldn't read these footnotes because if it's going to be a lot of this, Italian stuff, it's not going to be really worth it to me. The first of these, done by French Marxist-Leninists, seems to speak of a process of restoration just initiated in the USSR. The second, done by Italian Marxists, seems to allude to a process already, Italian Maoists, seems to allude to a process already substantially ended. End footnote. Moreover, although at times it is taken for granted that the Stalinist economy was socialist, occasionally it is claimed that the degeneration of the USSR only became evident after the death of Stalin, which presupposes that the degeneration existed earlier, even if only in a manner not altogether evident. Footnote. Lindenbau's discussion at the meeting of the Red Guards on the 3rd of November 1966 expressed how the origin of the capitalist restoration in the USSR must be located in the absence of an experience similar to the Cultural Revolution, i.e. in the absence of building of a vast workers' democracy. The accusation attacks all of Soviet history and even Lenin, but most of all it attacks Stalin, who during more than 25 years of exercising power, quote, forgot, end quote, to build an efficient workers' democracy, parenthesis, admitting that such forgetfulness can be imputed to a single individual. Parenthesis, admitting that such forgetfulness can be imputed to a single individual, end parenthesis. Thus it seems clear that the roots of the degeneration are to be discovered much earlier than Khrushchev's era. End footnote. According to Marx's, Engels, and Lenin's writings on the commune and on the dictatorship of the proletariat, the socialist state is characterized by the dictatorship of the many over the few. This refers to the following characteristics. A. Control, that is, the participation from below and the right to recall representatives at any time, as opposed to principles of appointment, of co-optation, of irremovability, and of historical responsibility towards superiors typical of bourgeois democracy. B. The executive and not merely legislative functioning of assemblies, in order to prevent their being reduced to merely decorative, quote, chatter sessions, end quote. C. Economic egalitarianism, even if only relative, in the fight against privileges. D. The suppression and substitution of a regular army, understood as a bureaucratic apparatus contraposed to the collectivity, by an armed populace so as to realize, even at the level of military repression, the overcoming of the separation between civil society and the state, thus facilitating a diffusion of power below. This theory is by no means abstract, but encapsulates, on the basis of the experience of the commune, the characteristics a state must have in order to express the interest of the great majority of the people, guided by the proletariat. Footnote: a work by Korsch was recently published, La Commune Rivoluzionaria, in Giovanni Critica 20, in which the theses of Lenin and Marx are accused of formalism because they tend to stress certain formal juridical characteristics of the state while de-emphasizing its social substance. We are surprised that such a critique should be made by an author of Korsch's stature. The use of, quote, formal, end quote, characteristics by Lenin and Marx corresponds to the social substance of a state that is no longer the instrument of an elite against the masses, but which is gradually being absorbed by civil society. From this comes the subordination, without any privilege, of the functionaries to the citizens, the substitution of the army by armed people, etc. The writings of Lenin have recently been subject to a series of acute criticisms. See Miliband's article, The State and Revolution, published in Monthly Review. These criticisms have revealed a few limits and gaps, particularly with respect to the problem of the mediation of power in the dictatorship of the proletariat, However, even Miliband admits that anti-bureaucratic project that motivated Lenin remains valid and is exactly such a project that inspired the major points mentioned in the text. End footnote. If we examine the Soviet state, the discrepancy between these criteria and reality becomes obvious. First of all, consider economic planning, a most fundamental element for a state that calls itself socialist. In the Soviet Union, command and appointment from above is an undisputed principle that allows no real element of participation from below. Various post-Stalin reforms have not changed the situation. For example, the law of the 15th of July 1958 gave limited powers to workers and their organizations, production assemblies, union committees, to deal with such minor matters as food services, health services, etc., granting such rights, which were more or less consultative in character, left the hierarchical structure of the factory and of the economy untouched. Where am I? Footnote: on the functioning of the Soviet economy before the 1965 reforms, see especially Alec Nova, The Soviet Economy, published in 1961. On the lack of real democracy in the factories, see Muscli, something from Italy, and Boffa, who writes, quote, one cannot talk about intervention, by the workers, Antonio Carlo, in the management of enterprises, and the unions remain purely bureaucratic entities, public offices rather than associations without any political initiative, end quote. And most workers are, quote, consulted, end quote. End footnote. Let us take a closer, highly schematic look at how a plan is launched. It is elaborated at the upper levels of the party and government without any actual proletarian participation. Even after the, quote, liberal, end quote, reforms of 1965. Give me 1 second. Sorry. The plan is then approved by the Party Congress and ratified by the Supreme Soviet, which also allocates the necessary financial laws to put the plan into effect. The last footnote, there's a footnote, but the last footnote I read wasn't finished because it ended, doesn't matter. Footnote. On the juridical formal method of approving the plan, see Scott, Russian Political Institutions, published 1961. On the lack of democracy in planning, particularly in the agricultural sector, see Gadi, Mezzo Secolo di Agricoltura, and Solomon Schwartz's Russia's Soviet Economy, published in 1954. I think Solomon Schwartz's work on the Soviet Union, Soviet economy is very highly estimated by a lot of people. Even though it's old, people still use it, I think. The party and the government are by now largely fused. Parenthesis, the ministers are usually high-ranking members of the party, end parenthesis, and therefore one can speak of a state-party summit. End footnote. New footnote. Scott notes how the plan is approved while it is already being executed, parenthesis, often in an advanced stage, end parenthesis. In substance, the, quote, sovereign, end quote, agencies merely ratify accomplished facts. At this point, it could be argued that the interventions of the Supreme Soviet and of the Party Congress are the, quote, democratic, end quote, moments in the elaboration of the plan. Such reasoning, however, is useless since the Supreme Soviet is an empty and discredited organism. It performs no executive functions, convenes briefly for 2 to 10 days, 2 or 3 times a year, votes unanimously most of the time, rarely proposes modifications or amendments, and discussion is almost wholly lacking. All of this is admitted even by those Italian communist officials considered experts on Russian affairs. A similar degeneration is evident in the party, where a very restricted elite monopolizes the most important decisions, parenthesis, such as de-Stalinization, the fall of Khrushchev, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. While excluding any real participation from below. Footnote. On this, see Muskeli, as well as the testimony of Boffa, who writes, quote, its, bracket, the Supreme Soviets, end bracket, sessions are always very brief, the work limited to a few points, the discussions are generic, the questioning non-existent, while legislative activities, i.e. its main functions, are reduced to a minimum, although serious and old gaps remain in Soviet legislation. The election of the government constitutionally fails within the prerogatives of the Supreme Soviet, yet it was not deemed essential to convene it when Kosygin took over Khrushchev's position as president of the Congress. End quote. On the same page, one reads that elections are, quote, plebiscite demonstrations extraneous to political discussion, which always end up with votes going to the only candidates nominated. End quote. In 1959, a law was passed in homage to the Paris Commune that rendered all elected officials subject to recall. This, however, did not change the situation. When Marx, Engels, and Lenin spoke of the revocability of the elected as an expression of a substantially new principle, they assumed that the assemblies would function in a manner and in a context totally different from that of the Supreme Soviet, where assemblies have become completely powerless. This does not mean that revocability is in itself a merely formal judicial principle, as Korsch maintains. It becomes such only when it is placed in a context that differs from that outlined by Lenin in State and Revolution. In the Russian context, where neither egalitarianism nor the armed populace, nor real, quote, social, end quote, planning, nor freedom of expression and political choice, parenthesis, for the proletariat, end parenthesis, exists. The 1959 law is merely a propagandistic caprice. Next footnote. On this point, see the testimony of Boffa, who writes, quote, the highest organ of the party was diluted into a number of shapeless assemblies which, on par with the Supreme Soviet, unanimously approved the decisions made by the leadership of the party, end quote. End footnote. I just wanted to look something up. Kosygin, Alexei Kosygin lived from 1904 to 1980 and was a Soviet statesman during the Cold War. Alexei Kosygin served as the premier of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1980 and was one of the most influential Soviet policymakers in the mid-1960s, alongside with General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev. Alexei Kosygin was born in the city of St. Petersburg in 1904 to a Russian working-class family. Kosygin was conscripted into the Labor Army during the Russian Civil War, and after the Red Army's demobilization in 1921, Kosygin worked in Siberia as an industrial manager. Kosygin returned to Leningrad in the early 1930s and worked his way up the Soviet hierarchy. During the Great Patriotic War, or World War II, Kosygin was tasked by the State Defense Committee with moving Soviet industry out of territories soon to be overrun by the German army. Alexei Kosygin served as Minister of Finance for a year before becoming Minister of Light Industry, later Minister of Light Industry and Food, Stalin moved Kosygin from the Politburo 1 year before his own death in 1953, intentionally weakening Kosygin's position within the Soviet hierarchy. Stalin died in 1953, and on the 20th of March 1959, Kosygin was appointed to the position of chairman of the State Planning Committee, Gosplan, a post he would hold for little more than a year. Kosygin next became first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers. When Nikita Khrushchev was removed from power in 1964, Kosygin and Leonid Brezhnev succeeded him as premier and first secretary, respectively. Therefore, as a member of the collective leadership, Kosygin formed an unofficial triumvirate, also known by its Russian name Troika, alongside Brezhnev and Nikolai Podgorny, the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet that governed the Soviet Union in Khrushchev's place. During the initial years following Khrushchev's ouster, Kosygin initially emerged as the leading figure in Soviet politics. In addition to managing the Soviet Union's economy, Kosygin assumed a preeminent role in its foreign policy by leading arms control talks with the U.S. and overseeing relations with Western countries in general. However, the onset of the Prague Spring in 1968 sparked a severe backlash against Kosygin's policies, enabling Leonid Brezhnev to decisively eclipse Kosygin as the dominant force within the Politburo. While he and Brezhnev disliked one another, Kosygin remained in office until being forced to retire on the 23rd of October 1980 due to bad health. Kosygin died 2 months later on the 18th of December 1980. Back to the text. As for unions, the degeneration process has been occurring there for quite some time. In addition, a, quote, armed populace, end quote, has never existed. Instead, there is a Red Army that closely resembles a traditional army in its hierarchical organization and separation from civil society. Footnote. In addition to Boffa's testimony, also see Deutscher, Trade Unions, Their Place in Soviet Labor, published in 1950. This work by the Polish historian was first published in 1949, but since then, nothing has changed concerning the nature of these organizations. This is pointed out by Lisa Foa in the introduction to the Italian edition of Deutscher's work. Another footnote. On this, see Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. Trotsky himself admits, however, that from the beginning the Red Army had a, quote, permanent and essentially traditional character. Stalin only helped to accentuate this traditional character, and his successors conserved it. Even for what regards foreign policy, the USSR remained completely outside the kind of schemes that should guide a socialist state. Even if at times it uses as a threat the revolutionary movements that it helps in a limited and instrumental manner, end footnote. The resemblance is so close, in fact, that apologists would be hard-pressed to point out significant differences between the Soviet and Western armies, aside from the fact that the Red Army defends the, quote, socialist homeland, end quote. Another fundamental point of Marxist thought is egalitarianism and the problem of overcoming the barrier between intellectual and manual labor. While the Chinese have made serious attempts to confront this problem, the Russians have generally ignored it, propagandistic proclamations notwithstanding, In a recent series of Italian conferences, Lieberman has had to admit that there was a salary spread of about 1 to 10, which the 1965 reforms tended to broaden. Wikipedia says, the 1965 Soviet economic reform, sometimes called the Kosygin reform or Lieberman reform, named after E.G. Lieberman, was a set of planned changes in the economy of the USSR. A centerpiece of these changes was the introduction of profitability and sales as the two key indicators of enterprise success. Some of an enterprise's profits would go to three funds used to reward workers and expand operations. Most would go to the central budget. The reforms were produced politically by Alexei Kosygin, who had just become the premier of the Soviet Union following the removal of Nikita Khrushchev and ratified by the Central Committee in September 1965. The reforms reflected some long-simmering wishes of the USSR's mathematically oriented economic planners and initiated the shift towards increased decentralization in the process of economic planning. The reforms coincided with the Eighth Five-Year Plan, led to continued growth of the Soviet economy. Central planners were ultimately unsatisfied with the impact of the reform, and most changes were reversed by the early 1970s. Economists like Lev Gutovsky and Lieberman were instrumental in framing the theoretical underpinnings of the Soviet economic reforms of the 1960s, advocating the use of profit motives and market mechanisms within a socialist framework. According to Wikipedia, Evsei Lieberman lived from 1897 to 1981 and was a Soviet economist who lived in Kharkov, Ukrainian SSR. Evsei Lieberman is noted as the architect of the Soviet economic reform of 1965, also known as Liebermanism. Back to the text. Yet the Soviet income spread is actually much broader. Under the Russian fiscal system, incomes can range from 100 to 7,000 or more rubles a month, and Soviet ministers earn a nominal stipend, which is 100 times greater than the wage of a manual worker, this in addition to routine privileges, Footnote. See Dumas, I problemi agrari del comunismo, published in 1966 in Milan. In a Russian kolkhoz, the salary spread among only manual laborers is about 1 to 11. This book was translated in Russia as an example of constructive criticism. Dumas notes, among other things, that the spread among agricultural laborers is greater in Russia than in France, a capitalist country. End footnote. Next footnote. See D'Angelo and Palladino, La Sfida di Khrushchev, and Bloomer, La Rivoluzione Culturale Cinese. However, Soviet leaders often admit the need for bettering the minimum wage considered to be too low. Nevertheless, Kosygin had to admit that the minimum wage would stabilize in 1964 around 40 to 50 rubles as opposed to the 50 to 60 that had been foreseen. End footnote. There is no doubt that in Marx's thought, egalitarianism is to be understood in a relative sense, at least in the transitional phase, Given the fact that egalitarianism is more difficult to realize in a relatively underdeveloped country, one can easily justify the 1 to 5 income spread for China noted by Bettelheim. In Russia, however, the spread is enormously broader, even though the USSR is the world's second industrial power in total production. It is clear, therefore, that the, quote, relative, end quote, egalitarianism of the Soviet Union is identical to that of a society torn by insoluble social antagonisms. Footnote: in reality, there is a connection between distribution and production, and the increasing presence of the already grave inequalities in the distribution of income is an indication on the phenomenological level of an antagonistic society. On the organic connection between production, distribution, and consumption, see Marx's Grundrisse, page 88FF. End footnote. Section 2. Trotsky's Theses. As early as the mid-1930s, Trotsky had shown the degeneration of the constituent cells of the Soviet state with an unsurpassed superstructural analysis. Footnote: see Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed, and his Stalin. See Mandel, Neville, Le Nouveau Leviathan, Deutscher, The Prophet Outcast, Deutscher, La Rivoluzione Incompiuta, Marie, Stalin, Illuminati, Sociology e Classi Sociali. The difference between these and the difference between base and superstructure, recently contested by Coletti, has been defended by Timpanaro in a piece titled Engels, Materialismo e Libero Arbitrio in Quaderni Piacentini. We agree with Timpanaro. The claim that accepting the dichotomy would exclude the social character of production is not convincing. Society should be seen as a totality composed of various levels, economic, political, ideological, etc., each of which has a socio-historical character. End footnote. Back to end footnote. As early as the mid-1930s, Trotsky had shown the degeneration of the constituent cells of the Soviet state with an unsurpassed superstructural analysis. Yet the Russian revolutionary did not extend his negative judgment to Soviet economic structures. The anti-socialist degeneration was seen as having occurred solely at the political level. According to Trotsky, what happened was very similar to the phenomenon analyzed by Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Given the weakness of Russian social classes, the state was able to gain a relative autonomy in relation to the existing classes, none of which was able to administer power by itself, Eventually, the bureaucracy seized power and took a large cut of national income. Still, according to Trotsky, property relations remained socialist in character, in the same way that productive relations in Louis Bonaparte's France were capitalist, while the bourgeoisie was under the, quote, tutelage, end quote, of the bureaucratic state machinery. In Russia, for Trotsky, it was the working class that was under the, quote, tutelage, end quote, of the bureaucracy. To support his analysis, Trotsky pointed to the fact that individual members of the bureaucracy could not alienate or transfer state property in their own individual interest, and that legal formal definitions of property had not changed since it was socialized after the revolution. The second argument is not decisive, since very often formal legal definitions do not reflect actual relations, but mystify actual relations for propagandistic and ideological aims in order to defend a class rule by legitimizing it. The first argument, on the other hand, is based on the presupposition that the characteristics of bourgeois property in one of its historical phases are those of every type of property. Footnote. On the other hand, this problem cannot be reduced to the formal legal character of property. Marx noted in See Capital Volume 3 that similar economic structures often differ on the basis of their particular historical conditions. In this case, what must be uncovered are the basic laws that govern the productive relations (structure) in the USSR. Whether certain juridical formal characteristics can differ in different social formations is a secondary problem. End footnote. Actually, ownership of the means of production, understood as the power to dispose of them for one's interest outside of any veto and control, in Russia belongs to the bureaucracy, considered collectively as a class. Footnote. One could object that the concept of property used in the text is somewhat indeterminate, and this would go against Marx's warning to be, quote, precise, quote, especially with the concept of property. See, for instance, The Poverty of Philosophy. However, such an objection would not be all that valid, because certain specific characteristics of bureaucratic ownership have already been mentioned in the text, e.g. its belonging to a class considered collectively and not its individual members, end parenthesis. End footnote. Thus, it is not strange that the individual bureaucrat cannot individually dispose of it. Group ownership, where individuals do not have the power to dispose of common goods, has existed for thousands of years, e.g. the communal property of ancient Germanic communities, end parenthesis. In our case, the group owning, quote, goods, end quote, i.e. the whole Russian economic apparatus, end parenthesis, is a social class that runs the economy according to specific relations of production. The most devastating critique of Trotsky's analysis is Rizzi's. Footnote. See his Il collectivismo burocratico, published in, republished in 1967. Also see Collin and Mogilevsky, whose article, their open letter to the party, is going to be on the channel. Collin and Mogilevsky also follow the, quote, school, end quote, of bureaucratic collectivism. According to Rizzi, it is the bureaucracy that makes plans, directs production, determines prices, distributes the national income, and coordinates the means of production. Thus, it must be considered as the class owning the means of production. To talk about socialist or workers' property and structures, logically implying ownership by workers as a whole, is simply absurd when this collective is totally excluded from fundamental, even microeconomic, decisions. It is useless to object that the bureaucracy cannot appropriate all the surplus production created by the workers. Actually, this, quote, inability, end quote, which does not prevent the bureaucracy from treating itself very well, end parenthesis, does not result from collective worker ownership. Rather, it is explained by the requirement for broadening reproduction posed by the need to conquer backwardness and by the antagonisms with capitalist countries which force the Soviet Union to reinvest the greater part of the surplus. The same is true for Europe and the United States, where the consumption of luxuries by the capitalists, although significant, absorbs only a minor part of the surplus. Most of it is reinvested to feed broadened capitalist reproduction. To object that the bureaucracy consumes less than the capitalists, although it takes care of itself much better than the rest of the Russian population, makes little sense for a Marxist who must emphasize the function that a social group performs in the production process. Having established that it is the bureaucratic apparatus which dominates production by running production in the bureaucratic apparatus's own interests, and by appropriating the social surplus, we will have to speak of the bureaucracy as a class. It cannot be maintained that the bureaucrats have managerial powers, but the bureaucrats cannot dispose of the productive apparatus. In the West, such a power is comparable to that of managers who do not own the companies that they run, rather foreign in the interest of stockholders. In the latter case, however, the owner can always recall or substitute the managers, and this actually happens, In Russia, the only way the proletariat has of recalling the bureaucracy is through a revolution. Short of this, the Russian workers cannot in any way prevent the bureaucrats from making basic choices in their own interests, except for marginal concessions that in specific situations every dominant class grants to its exploited people, In this light, it remains a mystery how the Russian bureaucracy can be said to hold only management power, but not power to dispose of property in its own interests. Similarly unexplainable remains the limited political and not social character of the anti-bureaucratic revolution by the working class. Further evidence of Trotsky's contradiction can be seen in the following passage, quote, "It is useless to say that the distribution of the productive forces in the various sectors of the economy, and in general the whole content of the plan will be drastically changed, when the plan will be determined by the interests not of the bureaucracy but of the producers themselves. But to the extent that the question of overthrowing the parasitic oligarchy remains still tied to the preservation of nationalized property, we must characterize the future revolution as political." End quote. I'm going to repeat that last sentence because part of it's in italics. But to the extent that the question of overthrowing the parasitic oligarchy remains still tied to the preservation of nationalized property, we must characterize the future revolution as political. End quote. Trotsky's italics. Trotsky does not deny that there is a need to modify, quote, drastically, end quote, the general content of the plan since it is determined by the interest of the bureaucracy. Such a phenomenon, however, is social in character insofar as it implies that the running of the economy is determined by bureaucratic interests. In the case of the manager of a large capitalist enterprise of which he owns no stocks, the interests of the strongest stockholders determine the running of the company. A workers' democracy at the factory and planning level has more than only political relevance. It constitutes a most essential element of socialist productive relations. Without it, socialist ownership is deprived of organs through which the will and interests of the proletariat can be expressed in the running of the productive apparatus and degenerates into an empty formal juridical definition lacking historical or practical importance. Trotsky's error was to assume that nationalized property was synonymous with worker and socialist ownership. Trotsky failed to realize that if the plan is dominated by the will and the interest of the bureaucracy, while the workers are alienated from the productive apparatus and the basic decisions, the identification between nationalized property and socialist ownership is only a formal legal fiction masking the basic impossibility of the working class to make decisions in its own interests. Trotsky actually accepts the theses of his critics, while formally conserving his own definition of a socialist state, which has nothing to do with the phenomenon that Trotsky himself described in the quoted passage. Footnote. Moreover, this is not the only passage in which Trotsky seems to fall into serious contradictions. In The Revolution Betrayed, we read, quote, "It, the bureaucracy, is in the full sense of the word the sole privileged and commanding stratum in the Soviet society." End quote. There is another particularity which is not any less important. The Soviet bureaucracy has expropriated the proletariat politically in order to defend by methods of its own the social conquest of the proletariat. But the very fact of its appropriation of political power in a country where the principal means of production are in the hands of the state creates a new and hitherto unknown relation between the bureaucracy and the riches of the nation. The means of production belong to the state, but the state, so to speak, quote, belongs, end quote, to the bureaucracy. If, then, the state, quote, belongs, end quote, in some way to the bureaucracy, and if the means of production belong to the state, then it is logical to conclude that the bureaucracy is both the dominant class and the, quote, ownership, end quote, class. Trotsky more or less admits this when he says that the bureaucracy is in the, quote, broadest sense of the word, end quote, the sole commanding stratum. For a Marxist, the, quote, broadest sense of the word, end quote, implies the presence of a class. And when Trotsky notes that new relations exist between the bureaucracy and the riches of the nation, of course the bureaucracy cannot be formally considered the, quote, owner, end quote, but such a formalistic argument is ridiculous from the mouth of a thinker of Trotsky's caliber. End footnote. That the bureaucracy and the system created by it is not destined to last for very long does not change anything. When a group of people appropriates in its own particular interest the surplus labor of others in a certain way and according to particular economic laws, we have classes and an antagonistic productive system. The duration of the system is not particularly relevant. The Asiatic mode of production lasted for thousands of years almost without change, while capitalism met very violent social and economic convulsions after about a century of life. Maybe even shorter than that. Where am I? Okay. Even more recent reformulations of Trotsky's thesis by Huberman and Sweezy are no longer acceptable. They speak not of class, but rather of a stratum or caste, which has not had time to, quote, solidify itself, end quote, as a class. Footnote. See Lessons of the Soviet Experience in Monthly Review, published in 1967. On many occasions, non-Trotskyist writers have made similar claims. See, for example, Diverger, Political Parties, Their Organization and Activity in the Modern State, published in 1969. Kosick, La Nostra Crisi Attuale. Bottomore, Elites and Society, published in 1966. Tom Bottomore having edited a body of work with Maximilien Rubel. The work of the Yugoslav communist Kardelji also develops a neo-Trotskyist analysis, although his conclusions tend to be rather apologetic. Kardelji views the bureaucracy as a caste necessary for the development of, quote, socialism, end quote, but destined to gradually extinguish itself. End footnote. Where am I? For Marx, class is determined by the relation of a group of people to the instruments of production and by the role they consequently play in productive relations. Marx distinguishes between a, quote, class in itself, end quote, and a, quote, class for itself, end quote. A class, quote, for itself, end quote, obtains when a. there is a group of subjects having common interests derived from the functions they perform in the productive process, class in itself, and B, these subjects are conscious of their function, and C, they organize to defend their own interests. The Soviet bureaucracy fulfills this criteria. It has an interest in defending its type of ownership. It has done everything to consolidate its position. Finally, it has at its disposal the political, military, and economic organization of the state and party. The Soviet bureaucracy is indeed transformed into a class for itself very rapidly, even more rapidly than did the bourgeoisie, This, however, does not rule out that the bureaucracy has formed itself as a class. Section 3. Towards a definition of capitalism. Before examining these the theses according to which the Soviet degeneration is structural in character, it is necessary to establish what exactly is meant by capitalism, since many people claim that the USSR has developed, or returned to, a particular form of capitalism. In this respect, it is not sufficient to point out that there is inequality, injustice, and exploitation in Russia. I'm going to repeat that because that's very important. In this respect, it is not sufficient to point out that there is inequality, injustice, and exploitation in Russia. This kind of thing exists in all antagonistic societies. We should recall Engels' admonishment not to place in the same bundle the laws regulating the productive relations in radically different places. By doing so, we run the risk of producing only banal tautologies. All right, I have 2 footnotes here. The first footnote that I missed earlier. The Marxist concept of class has been subjected to a host of different interpretations. By and large, the quote economistic end quote current, which emphasizes the connection between the productive structure and the class, has prevailed. For this perspective, see Bukharin, Historical Materialism, a System of Sociology. Other Marxist currents, however, stress the role of conscious organizational elements. Of course, they do not conceive of such elements as existing in a vacuum, but as rooted in the productive structure. On this, see Lukács, History and Class Consciousness, Goldman, The Human Sciences and Philosophy, and Osovsky, Class Structure and the Social Consciousness. Lenin seems to have moved in the direction of Bukharin. See his A Great Beginning in his collected works. The quote consciousness end quote position that put the emphasis on the superstructure, particularly with respect to political behavior, have recently been attacked by Poulantzas in Political Power and Social Classes. The latter has in turn been correctly criticized by Glucksmann in A propos de la théorie marxiste de l'état capitaliste vers une conception nouvelle de la politique in L'homme et la société, 11. In Marx, we find instances of both the quote objectivist end quote conception and the quote subjectivist end quote conception. See the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. These two positions, however, are not in themselves antithetical, since they correspond to the Marxist distinction between class in itself, existing at the structural level, but still not conscious and organized, and class for itself, conscious and organized, No matter which Marxist concept we stress, it is clear that the bureaucracy presents the distinguishing features of the class for itself, which includes and presupposes the existence of a class in itself, The fact that the bureaucracy wields political power as well as economic power does not mean that it is not a class. For the opposite point of view, see Illuminati and Baltimore. A class that has its roots in the economic structure remains tied to these roots even when elements of a superstructural character are added. End footnote. Footnote. See Engels' Anti-Düring. On the fact that the determination of the laws of movement and their irreducible specificity is a characteristic element of a historical social formation, see the writings of the school of Della Volpe, and in particular see Coletti, Marxism and Hegel. End footnote. The typical fundamental law of capitalist production is production for surplus value. Marx writes, quote, "The product of capitalist production is not a simple product, use value, nor a simple commodity. That is, a product provided with an exchange value. Its specific product is surplus value. Commodities that possess more exchange value, i.e., those commodities represent more value than that advanced in their production in the forms of commodities and money. In this, the working process appears only as a means, while the process of value creation, or the production of surplus value, appears as the end. As soon as the economist remembers this, capital is proclaimed wealth used in production to generate, quote, profit, end quote, end quote. I'm going to repeat that last sentence because there's a lot of italics in it. In this, the working process appears only as a means, while the process of value creation of the production of surplus value, appears at the end. As soon as the economist remembers this, capital is proclaimed wealth used in production to generate, quote, profit, end quote, end quote. Marx's italics. Footnote. Marx's position is recapitulated in a number of places, and on it he bases all of his analysis in Capital. On this point, see also Engels' Anti-Düring. It should be pointed out, however, that Marx seems to distinguish between absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. Marx maintains that only the latter is typical and exclusive of capitalism, while the former can also be found in pre-capitalist societies. In this passage, however, it seems that Marx underemphasized the specific character that the category of surplus value has for capitalism. Such a category presumes the existence of a process of creation of capital through which capital is reproduced by the creation of something more, surplus value, which takes on the form of commodities. In pre-capitalist societies, instead, the commodity category is not dominant. During certain historical periods, such societies may experience an expansion of mercantile activities, but as Kula has noted in his Teoria del modo di produzione feudale, this occurs in a manner quite different from capitalism. This is particularly true of feudalism, because there the market is not organically tied to the process of capital creation, realization of surplus value, Moreover, in the passage quoted in the text, written 7 to 8 years after the Grundrisse, Marx talks about a surplus value, a specifically exclusive element of capitalism, without any discussion between relative and absolute surplus value, This is confirmed in Capital, when, after admitting that it is possible to reconcile, but only up to a certain point, the forms of income in different societies, Marx states, quote, ... If we strip both wages and surplus value, both necessary and surplus labor, of their specific capitalist character, then certainly there remains not these forms, but merely their rudiments, which are common to all social modes of production, end quote. The warning against making hasty generalizations against the fundamental principle of historical specificity is therefore very clear. Surplus value is a form of income specific to capitalism. End footnote. I would question this last sentence. I would say that surplus value is not a form of income. Revenue and income, it would obviously be part of surplus value, but it's not strictly income. When I think of the word income, what I usually mean is that that money that is appropriated specifically for personal consumption, right? So, for instance, if you take profit, if you're own a factory and you're a capitalist and you own a factory, part of the surplus value that's produced in there will be distributed to other people. Part of the surplus value will be reinvested in the factory in order to facilitate the expansion or increase the productivity by reinvestment in machinery and so forth. That would not count as income. What would count as income is the moment of that profit that is appropriated by the capitalist for personal consumption purposes, right? So I think that the use of the income, the word income here is rather imprecise, but that's just me speaking. But I will say, that's just me speaking, but I do feel like that's quite a basic point. Anyway, from this and many similar passages, it follows that A, the fundamental law of capitalism is production for surplus value, parenthesis, profit, end parenthesis. Again, surplus value and profit, not the same thing, and there's different forms of profit. I think you could say there was only one form of surplus value being a more abstract category than profit. Anyway, from this and many similar passages, it follows that A, the fundamental law of capitalism is production for surplus value, parenthesis, profit, and parenthesis. B, surplus value assumes the specific form of a surplus of commodities, parenthesis, or in commodities, and parenthesis, exceeding the capital advanced. C, consequently, surplus value is a category tightly tied to the market. I'll agree with that. Surplus value is a category tightly tied to the market. Surplus value, commodity, market are the three fundamental pivots of capitalism. Only where they are dominant can a country be called capitalist. For Marx, the market operates through the anarchic competitive interaction of several capitals propelled by the aim of profit. The process of production for surplus value, parenthesis, implying the predominance of expanded rather than simple reproduction, in parenthesis, begins with a market that operates in an unplanned, blind, and spontaneous manner. Marx expresses this as follows, quote, by definition, competition is the internal nature of capital. Competition's essential characteristic is to appear as the reciprocal action of all capital, is an internal tendency appearing as imposed from outside. Capital does not and cannot exist except divided into innumerable capitals. For this, it is conditioned by the action and reaction of one upon the others, end quote. Marx. Footnote. See Marx's Grundrisse. Moreover, there are other writings where Marx openly states that in Capital, the book, he described the interconnection of several autonomous capitals. Furthermore, when Marx refers to, quote, total social capital, end quote, he always alludes to the sum of several autonomous capitals that act on the basis of similar laws of movement. Volume 3 of Capital lends further support to this statement. There Marx analyzed the laws of capital movement. Concerning the law of the equalization of the rate of profit, Marx claimed that without such a law, capital is inconceivable. This law in turn presupposed in Marx's scheme the anarchic competitive interaction of several autonomous capitals. Clearly, capitalism implies the exploitation of human labor, but does this exploitation always have to take the form of a wage relation? Marx seems to say so in many places. Yet a more careful examination of the work shows that Marx considers this a normal requirement of capitalism, precisely in those countries in which the system has assumed its purest form. There were situations, however, in which production for profit used anomalous forms of exploitation, such as slavery, situations which are nevertheless capitalist according to Marx. Clearly, Marx saw that the presence of the aim of profit rendered the economic laws of capital relatively dominant, even in an anomalous form. Footnote. See Marx's Capital, Volume 1, where he alludes to the use of American black slaves for the production of surplus value. On page 759, he says that the patriarchal slavery was transformed under the influence of the world market into a system of commercial exploitation, parenthesis, synonymous with capitalism in this context, end parenthesis. This is even clearer in the Marx of the third volume of Capital, where he alludes to those, quote, capitalist, end quote, entrepreneurs that use slaves in the colonies in order to obtain the maximum profit. Similarly, Lenin, in The Development of Capitalism in Russia, refers to capitalist enterprises that used feudal wage relations for the production of surplus value. Mariátegui has noted the existence of similar phenomena in the enterprises on the Peruvian coast. See Mariátegui's Problem of the Indian and the Problem of the Land in Mariátegui, 7 Interpretive Essays on Peruvian Reality. End footnote. Clearly, Marx saw that the presence of the aim of profit rendered the economic laws of capital relatively dominant even in anomalous forms. Thus far, Marx's definition of capitalism can be summarized as follows, quote, "Capitalism is that particular antagonistic mode of production based on expanded reproduction in search of surplus value, parenthesis, profit, in parenthesis, that operates through anarchic market competition of several autonomous productive units, parenthesis, capitals, end parenthesis," end quote. Yet this definition is derived from works dealing with 19th century capitalism when oligopolies were rare. Now when oligopolies are more the rule than the exception, it is justified to question the relevance of this definition. Footnote, see Galbraith, American Capitalism, published in 1956, and Silos Labini, Oligopoly and Technical Progress. End footnote. Obviously, capitalism has changed. Thus, individual property has become secondary in relation to corporate ownership, parentheses, stock companies, trusts, end parentheses. Marx would say that with the emergence of the great corporations, the capitalist system suppresses private ownership within itself. By this, Marx meant... Footnote. See Marx Capital, Volume 3. In particular, on page 439, Marx establishes an identity between private property and individual property, when he says that joint stock companies no longer risk their own property, but that of society. Nevertheless, it should be remembered that such property functions within a mercantilist capitalist system, i.e. a system characterized by production for surplus value as realized through the market. The joint stock company introduces a new element into capitalism. It permits the large capitalist to incorporate the property of others into his enterprise and to manage this property in any way he sees fit. However, this new element is always contained within the framework traced by Marx in Capital. For a similar perspective, see Miliband, The State in Capitalist Society. End footnote. By this, Marx meant only that individual, parenthesis, private, and parenthesis, ownership would be substituted for corporate ownership. He certainly did not imply that the mechanism of business competition would become less important, an assertion that would be indefensible now and even more so in Marx's time. Competition as the mechanism persisted, though in varying forms. The perfect competition that had determined prices in the 19th century gave way to imperfect competition in which cartels to a large extent determined prices. At any rate, even if imperfect competition is no longer based on prices, it is no less anarchic than the competition of the 19th century. In fact, it is more ferocious since now it obtains between giants, which have tremendous economic and political means at their disposal for influencing the market. Consider, for example, the enormous expenses poured into advertising, parenthesis, to rob someone else's consumers, end parenthesis, the swindling and intrigues in the stock exchange, the international intrigues, the financial support of coups and wars which serve to appropriate land capable of being exploited from a competitor, and so on. Within such a context, it does not seem appropriate to talk about, quote, organized, end quote, capitalism on the basis of some ambiguous hints in the old Engels. Footnote. This is not a this is a footnote that I missed. See Magdolf, The Age of Imperialism, published in 1969. Pannekoek, Organizzazione Rivoluzionaria e Consigli Operai. Samir Amin, Accumulation on a World Scale. On, quote, imperfect, end quote, competition siasa Galbraith. However, it should be made clear that price competition does not disappear in the oligopolistic system. Periodically, it reappears with new characteristics, as in the case of Adicite, referred to by Galeano. See The Denationalization of Brazilian Industry, published in Monthly Review. End footnote. State intervention in the economy cannot eliminate the competition which is internal to the nature of capital. Competition derives from the fact that each productive unit, small businesses or large oligopolies, acts for its own profit, to the advantage of other competitors and against the general interests of the community. To eliminate this feature, it would be necessary to eliminate the entire system, something the capitalist state is not prepared to do. The only thing that it can do is to create a legal political form which prevents the system from blowing sky high. A typical example is the 10-hour law in England. With respect to the first half of the 19th century, state intervention has certainly increased, even on the economic level. But the overall effect can only be to subdue the anarchic character of the system, not the anarchic character of competition. Footnote. In this case, see Lange, Political Economy, Volume 1, Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory, Volume 2. The position of Engels on organized capitalism appears to be isolated even within the Marxist classics. Marx noted that the monopolies do not eliminate the anarchy of capital, but reproduce the anarchy of capital on a different level. See his The Poverty of Philosophy. The more mature Lenin wrote that the system born of competition does not eliminate the anarchy of capital. No, on the contrary, it produces, quote, a series of sharp and sudden contradictions, end quote. End footnote. Given the transformation in the type of competition and the type of capitalist ownership, we should expect a similar transformation in the set of capitalist laws applicable to this new form of capitalism. Capitalist laws derived from the phase of perfect competition, such as the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the law of price-value correspondence, appear outdated. Footnote. There has been an attempt to formulate the law of the rate of profits to fall in different terms. See Gilman, The Falling Rate of Profit, published in 1957. As for the law of value, see Marx himself admits that it is applicable only in the absence of monopolies. See Capital, Volume 2. End footnote. Such laws and others depending on the dominance of a market mechanism do not therefore operate in the Soviet system. For example, when a commodity's price greatly exceeds its exchange value, a double exploitation obtains. Not only is the worker more exploited in comparison to productivity, the tendency of wages to fall behind increases in the level of productivity is well noted, end parenthesis. Not only does he produce surplus value in the productive process, but he is also forced to buy commodities at a price greater than their value. Cartel prices do in fact have their own logic. They allow the capitalist to increase his profits further than would be possible under perfect competition. To the exploitation in the productive process can be added the fraud of unequal exchange in the circulation phase. Sliding wage scales, trade union wage struggles, and other similar devices ease, but do not eliminate unequal exchange. The goods produced by the workers always remain commodities organically destined for exchange on the market, without which production bogs down and a crisis ensues. Production for the market, therefore, remains the guiding element of the system, and with it, the search for profit through exploitation of workers is in the productive process. This direct exploitation is compounded by the indirect exploitation in the form of inflated oligopolistic prices and declining real wages. The law of the average equalization of the rate of profit, which before was an expression of the law of value, today operates on new bases if we follow Hilferding's persuasive thesis. Footnote. See Hilferding's Finance Capital. The Austrian Marxist noted that in an oligopolistic system, capital cannot circulate freely from a sector with a low rate of profit to one with a higher rate. This is due to the enormous difficulties involved in gaining entry into a monopoly sector. The backward sector, however, must, quote, do something, end quote, to prevent its elimination. The two following possibilities exist. A. Cartel prices that permit the more backward sector to raise its prices. B. Combination, i.e. joining in a more advanced sector. End footnote. Yet the earlier definition of capitalism is elastic enough to include modern capitalism's distinguishing features as well as its elements of continuity with classical capitalism. As such, we can now compare the Soviet system with this definition of capitalism sufficiently, quote, orthodox, end quote, and specific, yet inclusive of neo-capitalism, in order to see whether or not the Soviet system falls under it. Section 4. Wittfogel's and Hilferding's Theses. Wittfogel has argued that the Soviet system is nothing but a rerun of the old Asiatic mode of production, which he calls Oriental despotism or a hydraulic or agro-managerial society. Footnote. See Wittfogel, Oriental Despotism, published in 1957. End footnote. Wittfogel's theories have been bombarded by generally valid criticism which need not be reiterated here. Footnote. See Sofri, Il modo di produzione asiatico, and Chesnu, L'Asia nella storia di domani, which, however, quote, ideologically, end quote, exalts the Soviet Union. End footnote. What needs to be stressed is the inappropriateness of comparing an advanced industrial society, like the Soviet one, whose organic character is broadened reproduction, and societies based on, quote, natural production, end quote, where simple reproduction or production for consumption is predominant. Although there are sporadic and occasionally brief spans of expanded reproduction, for example, with particular and fortunate climatic conditions, end parenthesis. Footnote. On this possibility, see Sofri, where Sofri clearly demonstrates that Marx admitted the possibility of expanded reproduction in pre-capitalist societies, although as a sporadic and exceptional phenomenon. Marx noted that the pre-capitalist modes of production, and in particular the Asiatic mode of production with which Wittfogel is preoccupied, are characterized by a low level of development of the productive forces, and that production is mainly for personal satisfaction of the participants' needs. Accumulation and expanded reproduction have here a generally secondary and sporadic character. While the fundamental problems of the Soviet system which determine the dynamic lulls and contradictions stem from the unbalanced relation between the primary and secondary industrial sectors, from the impossibility of planning, to to provide everything for a certain level of industry, etc. Such themes are extraneous to a society of the, quote, natural type, end quote. They obtain only in a dynamic and industrial society characterized by certain particular laws of development working through the mediation of a plan. This type of society is transitory and crisis-bound. It could be said that it is the most, quote, transitory, end quote, of human societies. In contrast, history has shown Oriental despotism to be anything but transitory. Even the interventions of the Mandarin's bureaucracy in the economy are not directly comparable with those of the Soviet state. The nature of the intervention differs in terms of dimensions and limits. In the Oriental system, the state developed important public works, parenthesis, for example, dams and canals, hence the name hydraulic state, that aimed at defending and guaranteeing agricultural production primarily based on local consumption. Surplus destined for the market was rather modest. Footnote. On this see Barrington Moore Jr.'s The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, end footnote. The countryside was dominated by a vast group of rich landowners who had a significant function in the relations of production. Footnote. Wittfogel himself does not deny the existence of these rich farmers. Wittfogel writes, quote, but even when the agro-despotic state carries out its directive functions on the maximum, it does not act within the economy, remaining therefore semi-directive, end quote. Our evaluation does not change even when we take into account that the Asiatic state often developed a limited account of industrial activity, parenthesis, cast iron production, end parenthesis, as has been revealed by the studies of Balish. Such a very limited type of industrial activity did not have the dimensions and could not have the problems that faced the Soviet industrial plan. End footnote. In the Soviet system, rather, the fundamental problem is the development of industrial production on a broadened scale through forced accumulation based on restricting consumption and agriculture. Soviet state intervention, then, is much more massive and its goals are quite different. Hilferding's analysis is quite different. Although it is only a bare outline, it points out some basic elements of the Soviet economy, and in particular the clear predominance of the plan over the market. Thus, to talk about a monopoly state capitalism is clearly absurd given the almost total absence of mercantile elements. Even prices and wages in this context assume a quite different importance. Footnote. See State Capitalism or Totalitarian State Economy by Hilferding in C. Wright Mills' book, The Marxists, published in 1962. End footnote. Hilferding's analysis, of course, needs further elaboration. Generally speaking, Hilferding ignores the contradictions that threaten the Soviet economy, and Hilferding unwarrantedly equates the Russian economy with that of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Hilferding, furthermore, argues that the Soviet bureaucracy, parenthesis, subjected to the ferocious purges resulting in the Moscow trials of 1936-38, end parenthesis. I don't know if I said parenthesis the first time, but anyway, Hilferding furthermore argues that the Soviet bureaucracy, subjected to the ferocious purges resulting in the Moscow trials of 1936-38, is not the owner of the means of production. The bureaucracy, Hilferding argues, had no real autonomous power. It was only a tool in Stalin's hands. Actually, there are no historical instances of power invested solely in an individual. No one can dominate an immense society by himself. Quote, personal power, end quote, means only a very high level of centralization with one person at the apex. This person, however, does not make decisions as an isolated individual, but only as the exponent of certain forces of which he is the highest hierarchical expression. The events following Stalin's death make our point clear. After Stalin's death, this so-called, quote, personal power, end quote, was invested in a group of colleagues from the central political bureaucracy. Although they loosened the high level of discipline that Soviet society had found to be intolerable, the fundamental Soviet economic structure has remained unaltered. at least up to 1965, with the possible exception of some reforms which, however, have left the whole essentially unchanged. They did, however, recognize the principle of collective direction by people who were the expression of the party and the central political bureaucracy. And this indicates a substantial continuity between the two epochs, the only difference being a Jacobin discipline and a hierarchical centralization with no room for opposition, necessary during the heroic stage of building the system. These elements, however, are not the expression of the arbitrary power of an isolated tyrant, but that of the necessity imposed by building a system that has survived Stalin and his alleged, quote, personal power, end quote. Section 5. Marcuse's, Burnham's, and Gilas's theses. Herbert Marcuse confronts the problem of the nature of the USSR in his Soviet Marxism. Marcuse has no doubts that Russia has undergone structural degeneration. Unfortunately, Marcuse does not go into the fundamental character of this structure, and his analysis is left suspended at a superstructural level. While Marcuse makes some interesting comments, e.g. concerning the ossification of Marxist theory, Marcuse does not deal with the structural problems that are at issue here. Gilas's the new class is at a less sophisticated level. Basically, there's nothing really new in Gilas's the new class. Most of Gilas's correct observations had already been elaborated by Rizzi in his polemic with Trotsky. Much of Burnham can be traced back to Rizzi, although his distinction between the bureaucracy and the technocrats as two strata of one class is original. The technocrats, according to Burnham, constitute the ruling wing of this class. Footnote: The Managerial Revolution by Burnham. Burnham also maintained that even in the West, the technicians are at the point of dispossessing the capitalists and taking over power, parenthesis, a tendency supposedly expressed by the rise of the corporate manager, end parenthesis. Contrary to Burnham, however, our analysis shows how the Soviet system cannot automatically develop in the West. Moreover, Burnham's thesis has been buried under an avalanche of criticism which need not be recapitulated here. Quote, managerialism, end quote, has been resurrected by Galbraith in his The New Industrial State. Aside from the term, quote, technostructure, end quote, this book does not add anything new, nor does it really refute the criticisms leveled against managerialism. End footnote. Actually, the situation is somewhat different. In 1928 to 29 in Russia, the economic power was centralized in the hands of the central political bureaucracy represented by Stalin. Those technocrats who opposed its decisions were eliminated by administrative methods. Stalin's death gave these technocrats the opportunity to advance a series of demands aimed at restoring capitalism at the expense of the bureaucracy's power. This suggests that the technocrats saw themselves as a force external and opposed to the bureaucracy. The Chinese have contributed the most in bringing the debate on the nature of the USSR down from the domain of, quote, political experts, end quote, to that of world politics. Nevertheless, their position is problematic. Their characterization of the present period in the USSR as capitalism and of the Stalinist period as socialism is unconvincing. Moreover, they often advance contradictory positions in other matters and fail to develop their analyses to their logical conclusions. Thus, Lin Bao identified the beginnings of Soviet degeneration in the Stalinist phase when no attempt was made to introduce a series of democratic proletarian organs. Without such organs, revolutionary conquests become problematic, even at the economic level. This seems to imply that, if workers' democracy was absent, it is necessary to analyze its causes while denying the socialist character of the Stalinist era. Socialism without a workers' democracy as described in State and Revolution is unimaginable. Western Maoist accounts are even worse. Not only do they ignore the positive elements of Lin Bao's account, but they deteriorate to a dull and trivial exaltation of the Stalinist era. They completely overlook the tendencies such as the struggle against egalitarianism, bureaucratization of unions, alienation of the workers from planning, material incentives, etc., are not very new developments, as Lin Bao himself admits. It becomes altogether inexplicable for Western Maoists how and why people like Lieberman and Nemencenev appear armed with profit rates and, quote, material interests, end quote. One second. Okay. It becomes altogether inexplicable for Western Maoists how and why people like Lieberman and Nemencenev appear armed with profit rates and, quote, material interests, end quote. If during the Stalinist era there really had been a dictatorship of the proletariat, parenthesis, in spite of certain, quote, negligible, end quote, deviations, end parenthesis, if the proletariat really educated the proletariat itself to power for several decades, it is necessary to explain how and why these, quote, evil men, end quote, have gained power without running into violent proletarian reactions. Footnote. Such a position emerges from the writings of Italian Maoists who, at best, refer to imprecise, quote, errors, end quote, without placing them dialectically within their historical context. Moreover, Western Maoists perceive the process of capitalist restoration as proceeding in a linear and peaceful manner. See Huberman and Sweezy, La Contra-Rivoluzione Globale. The process instead proceeds in a dialectical manner through the class struggle between the bureaucrats and the technocrats. Despite the Czech affair, Maoists do not see a conflict between different groups of revisionists. End footnote. Section 6. State capitalism. According to Bordiga, Russia is an example of a particular form of monopoly state capitalism. Footnote. The theory of state capitalism is very popular. See, for example, Fromm, Beyond the Chains of Illusion, published in 1963, Balazs, La Bureaucratie Céleste, Mallet, Bureaucratie et Technocratie dans les pays socialistes, in L'Homme et la Société. For the latest discussion on those authors who speak of state capitalism, see Neville, La Salaire Socialiste. In this current, a fundamental work is that of Chalus, Castoriadis, Les rapports de production en Russie, from 1949. End footnote. Bordiga's argument is weak for, as Trotsky rightly noted, the Leninist conception of state capitalism presumes the existence of a bourgeoisie, in whose name the state organizes capitalist production. Parenthesis, within the limits imposed by an anarchistic competitive system, end parenthesis. Footnote, see Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. Trotsky is followed on this point by various people such as Mandel, Illuminati, Neville, Deutscher, etc. When these conditions do not obtain, i.e. when the state destroys the bourgeoisie and centralizes the productive apparatus in its own hands, there is a complete subversion of the market, and capitalism, as defined earlier, can no longer be said to exist. No one would deny that the categories of commodity, market, and profit are crucial for capitalism. Let us examine whether or not these capitalist criteria apply to the Soviet economy. Koran and Mogilevsky claim that, quote, as opposed to capitalism, the bureaucracy does not need to realize its surplus or that part of the total product that corresponds to the depreciation of constant capital in the market. It is the owner of all the businesses and of all production, and therefore does not have to buy from itself. If the passage of steel from the mill to the factory, or of coal from the mine to the mill, is registered as an acquisition of means of production, it is in reality a simple form of product transfer within the framework of the same ownership, and is not a true and proper deed of sale. End quote. Koran and Mogilevsky. According to this line of reasoning, the categories of commodity market and surplus value profit do not exist or are secondary to the Soviet economy. The workers produce surplus product but not surplus value, since surplus value in Marx is organically tied to the market. It has been objected that such reasoning is formalistic and hasty, since in the primary sector, production of capital goods, money appears as a mercantile category, implying the presence of exchange. Footnote. See Bettelheim, Planification et Croissance Accélérée. Stalin had earlier denied the commodity character of goods from the state sector, with arguments partly similar to those of Koran and Mogilevsky, i.e., that it was not a transfer of property, in his Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. Stalin's thesis was largely accepted by Guevara in his polemic with Bettelheim. End footnote. This counter-argument, however, assumes that money necessarily performs the same function that it performs in capitalism. After all, money also existed in many pre-capitalist systems. Money here does not play the role of a mediator of exchange, selling, something difficult to imagine when there is only one owner. As has been shown by others, money here is a mere bookkeeping instrument and a measure of value, which has the function of regulating the distribution of wealth projected by the plan. The fundamental function of money here is different from that played in a market economy. Footnote. See Mink, Economia Politica del Socialismo, and Mandel, Economic Theory, Volume 2. Nevertheless, Mink appears to attribute other functions to money. As such, his theory approaches that of Bettelheim. On this last point we cannot agree. For us, money in the primary sector cannot but have a bookkeeping function as a measure of value. This lack of a, quote, real payment, end quote, has led some to argue that the managers of the Soviet economy behave as if their equipment was free, and that this is the source of the dysfunctions and waste. End footnote. The fundamental function of money here is different from that played in a market economy. It would be useless to object that these arguments deal only with the superstructural level, since all monetary circulation obtains at that level. The reason the bureaucracy uses bookkeeping money in relations between state enterprises is clear and simple. First of all, calculating units of labor time presents, as even Bettelheim admits, a series of presently unsolved practical difficulties. A socialist society would confront and solve similar difficulties, but it turns out that calculations in terms of labor time would render social relations clear and transparent. It doesn't take much to understand that in a conflict-ridden society where one class lives off the surplus labor of another, the dominant class has every reason to mystify exploitative relationships behind a socialist facade. The interest of the bureaucracy lies in presenting itself as the vanguard of socialism. Consider the kolkhoz, or collective farm. Without a doubt, they are state enterprises masked as cooperatives. According to Stalin, there should be mercantile relations between the kolkhoz and the state, and clearly they have increased since 1958. Footnote. Never mind. No footnote. But the exchanges are only apparently mercantile, hiding the real bureaucratic appropriation that would contradict any natural mercantile mechanism. Prices are often nominal and in many cases do not even cover the cost of production. The quote, payment, end quote, of the state, therefore, serves only to permit the kolkhoz to reintegrate only part of their provision in order to perpetuate their activity. The problem of the industrial sector producing consumer goods, which has always had a secondary importance vis-a-vis the capital goods sector, which has always had a secondary importance vis-a-vis the capital goods sector, is more complicated. In this domain, the exchange relation between the state that sells and the consumer citizen who buys also has a nature profoundly different from mercantile and capitalist forms of exchanges. Speaking about socialist products destined for consumption, Mink writes, quote, ... it is claimed that this product has a double character. In it are present the characteristics of the special product directly connected to the aim of socialist production, its planned character, and the characteristics of the commodity. The product of modern socialist economy is no longer only a commodity, as in the case of the product of an economy of simple mercantile production or a capital product. Those who produce commodity products only want to find a buyer on the market and bring in the highest possible proceeds in the case of simple mercantile production, or the highest possible profit in the case of capitalist production. In a socialist economy, however, production is based on a state plan meant to realize the social ends of socialist production, i.e. to maximize the satisfaction of the chosen social needs of the period. End quote. Mink. Aside from the ideological character of the last statement, the bureaucracy has its own, not society's, interest. At heart, the passage does contain some insights. In East European regimes, consumer goods do not aim at bringing the maximum price or maximum profit, but furnish consumers with as much as is necessary for their needs according to the plan. Unlike in capitalism, here use value prevails over price or profit aims. An example may clarify the point. Oleg Antonov, a Soviet manager, refers to a grotesque case that happened in Moscow a few years ago. I don't know if this is the same guy, but it says, Wikipedia says Oleg Antonov was a Soviet airplane designer and the founder of the Antonov Design Bureau in Kiev, Ukraine, named in his honor. Antonov designed a number of Soviet airplanes such as the Antonov AN-2 and Antonov AN-12 and numerous gliders for both civilian and military use. Back to the text. The plan called for the production of a certain type of shoe which Russian consumers disliked. They demanded instead a different kind of shoe. The efforts of a consumer advocate to have the plan modified so that the new kind of shoe could be produced failed. The old shoes continue to be made and remain unsold. The example shows that exchange is part of an economy dominated by production for use value, even in the consumer goods sector. In fact, the plan establishes what use values to produce within a global frame of reference in order to reconstitute the labor power necessary to the system. Here, if the produced values do not correspond to consumer needs, and there is a, quote, consumer strike, end quote, as in the not unusual, end case, referred to by Antonov, the consequences are not like those in a capitalist economy where the realization of surplus value is what dominates market activity. Footnote: these phenomena have been pointed out by various journalists and scholars. See Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory, Volume 2. And Siofi, l'edificazione dell'economia sovietica. End footnote. Unsold shoes do not precipitate the crisis that is often identified with unrealized surplus value in a capitalist economy. There were no falls of profits and wages, unemployment, bankruptcies, etc., nor were artisans forced to close down or to adapt to market conditions, as would have been the case under mercantilism. All of this is lacking in Russia because there is no category of surplus value, and because exchange and other mercantilist mechanisms assume less importance in the Soviet than in capitalist or mercantilist systems. It is conceivable that the plan could assign the necessary use values to the consumers by means of bureaucratic administrative methods. But clearly such a solution would merely intensify the already acute social and political tensions because it would necessitate a further centralization of state authority. Thus it is understandable why the system of exchange subordinated to the plan is preferable. Yet some questions remain unanswered. If the main goal of this exchange is to provide use values to consumer producers, why does the plan not change immediately when some goods remain unsold, rather than continuing to produce goods that won't be sold? The phenomenon appears irrational, but not so from the perspective of the economy of the plan. For the planners, the consumer's needs must be subordinated to the needs of the plan. If there are consumer, quote, boycotts, so much the worse for the consumers. Boycotts hits consumers the hardest. Never in history have the exploited rejected the dominant system by starving themselves to death. In the long run, the Soviet consumer is forced to capitulate, although there may be exceptional stubbornness on this or that pair of shoes. The rationale is that it is better to produce goods that will remain unsold for a certain period of time than to modify the plan by taking into consideration the interests of the masses who remain outside the plan itself. This is so not only because the Russian economy is authoritarian and hierarchical in character, and does not readily accept rebukes from below, but because the interests of the masses are objectively aimed towards a broadening of the consumer goods sector. This, as we shall see, would literally explode the whole plan. Indeed, at times, the polemics generated by more macroscopic examples of dysfunction presumably force the system to make concessions, elimination or minimizing some of the more serious cases of waste in the consumer goods sector. While there is not much data to support this, it is clear that marginal concessions had been made before the 1965 reforms inaugurating the, quote, new course, end quote. The very emphasis of Soviet propaganda from Malenkov concerning the problem of consumer goods was a minor concession made to Russian consumers. It was a minor concession for, as we shall see, the Soviet plan cannot adequately develop the consumer goods sector, thus fully taking into account consumers' needs, within the domain of planning and of traditional relations of production. There is an additional reason to assume that concessions and adjustments had been made at some time or another. A system as advanced as the Russian cannot survive without at least neutralizing the great mass of workers. In Stalin's era, with the imperialist encirclement, forced development, and post-war reconstruction, sacrifices could be justified. Similar propagandistic justifications for similar sacrifices lost their credibility after the beginning of the 1950s when the USSR emerged as the second world power. However, whatever adjustments were made, they came about not within market mechanisms, as in capitalism, but within the overall structure of the plan. quote, adjustments, end quote, serve to eliminate or attenuate the more sensational dysfunctions of the type Antonov mentions in order to meet consumer needs for political reasons. At any rate, it should be evident by now that the Soviet economy is not characterized by the dominance of surplus value, market, and commodities. While market relations and commodities survive in a residual form in the small production within the kolkhoz, any mercantile element found in the framework of the system, money consumer state exchange, survive with characteristics and functions profoundly different than those of their counterpart in a market economy. The 1965 reforms, to a certain extent, have modified this framework by going beyond minor concessions and marginal adjustments. They have modified the logic of the plan in a mercantile direction. But on the whole, capitalist or mercantile categories do not apply to the Soviet system. Only under conditions where goods are produced by several economic units independent of each other can one speak of commodity and mercantile exchange. Marx says, quote, the products of labor do not become commodities unless they are products of independent private labors, i.e. carried out independently of each other, end quote. Marx's italics. Quote, the products of labor do not become commodities unless those products of labor are products of independent private labors, i.e. carried out independently of each other, end quote. Capitalism presumes the interaction of several autonomous capitals. To speak of commodities where these conditions do not obtain gives the same name to very different realities. One moment. Although Russian enterprises have always had a certain degree of autonomy, this autonomy has always been rigidly subordinated to the plan. The 65 reforms have only partly modified this situation. The type and quantity of the products, prices, investments, wages, number of employees, the destination of the product, the amount of surplus product, and planned orders were all dictated by the plan. Moreover, these orders were carried out under a fixed and unchangeable contract. In this context, it is really absurd to believe that state enterprises operate autonomously in real market relations, since the enterprise's autonomy and the material possession of their goods remain rigidly fixed within the plan. Even in the West, the branches of large enterprises have a certain relative autonomy, since headquarters cannot sanction everything in the last detail. No one, however, would describe this relation as mercantile. Branch plants are clearly subordinate. The same holds true for Soviet enterprises in relation to the plan, with one significant difference. Whereas the branches of large Western oligopolies are dependent on an economic unit, which competes with other independent units on the market for profit, Soviet enterprises operate within the context of a plan that controls the whole economy and manages production for ends different from those of the, quote, Western, end quote, system. Only when one confuses the concept of enterprise as a distinct productive unit, integrated in the play, USSR, and that of an enterprise as an independent unit, there's a typo. Only one confuses the concept of enterprise as a distinct productive unit, integrated in the plan, USSR, and that of an enterprise as an independent unit, the West, as Bettelheim does, one can easily establish mercantile relationships. Undoubtedly, with the 1965 reforms, the distinct economic units will become increasingly more independent. Before jumping to any hasty conclusions concerning the revival of mercantilist categories, a dialectical analysis must pull together the various phases of the process, its development and genesis. Those who anticipate the dominance of mercantile categories confuse the end of the process with the process's beginning. If the above is correct, it follows that the commodity market surplus value pivot, dominant in capitalism, is absent or secondary in the USSR, or at least categories such as the commodity operate in an altogether secondary role rather different from the way they do under capitalism. This would be true even if one were to accept Baran and Sweezy's thesis, according to which, in late capitalism, the category of, quote, surplus value, end quote, is obsolete and should be replaced with that of, quote, surplus, end quote, parenthesis, surplus product, end parenthesis. See Baran and Sweezy, Monopoly Capital. The fact remains, surplus is always organically connected to an economy dominated by the market and production for exchange. The surplus in question is, therefore, apart from linguistic similarities, something quite different from the Soviet surplus product. One second, sorry. Section 7. The concept of wage and productive labor in the USSR. We can approach our argument from a different angle, from the perspective of labor power. In the capitalist system, labor assumes commodity form, parenthesis, we talk about the labor market, end parenthesis. Labor's price is determined by the law of supply and demand and by the mercantile competition between capitals. In the Soviet system, the state is the monopolistic owner of the labor force. This, of course, like all economic phenomena, must be understood only in the tendential sense. The fact that labor fluidity is never totally repressed, that farmers escape working on collective enterprises, reveals that state domination is prevalent, but not absolute. Accordingly, the worker receives a wage fixed by the plan, independent of any substantial market law. A rapidly expanding capitalist society reaching full employment and a concomitant capitalist competition would normally drive wages upwards. Although Russia reached full employment by the beginning of the 30s, wages remained at the level determined by the plan. Of course, concessions, parenthesis, sometimes overrated, end parenthesis, have been granted to the proletariat. In general, however, wages have remained depressed to permit accumulation and Stalinist industrialization. Between 1928 and 1950, industrial production grew 6 times. Real wages, however, stayed below the 1928 level. This does not mean that labor productivity did not increase during this period. Although Soviet industrial development is labor-intensive and the projections of the plan have often failed to materialize, it is clear that the first plan's objective of obtaining a 100% productivity increase was only realized at a 41% level. Whatever increases did result, however, were not reflected in the real wages of the workers. The situation did not basically change after 1950, parenthesis, wage and consumption control to the advantage of accumulation, end parenthesis, although some of the more despised aspects of Stalinism were reduced. Clearly, the wage dynamic in Russia is very different from that of a capitalist society. Furthermore, not only do Russian workers work for only one boss, parenthesis, the state, end parenthesis, under conditions of his choice, but for a long time they could not even choose which state enterprise to work in. Steps were initially taken to tie the worker to the means of production at the beginning of the 1940s in response to the massive labor mobility that became problematic in the second half of the 1930s. Footnote: this was the case from 1940 to 1956. On this, see Dobb, Soviet Economic Development since 1917, published in 1966, and Baikov, The Development of the Soviet Economic System, published in 1946. The law was repealed in 1956. See Alec Nova's The Soviet Economy. And footnote. Under conditions of full employment and a high need for industrial workers, many moved from their factories in search of better conditions and higher pay. Capitalist bosses under similar circumstances would have been forced to increase their wages in order to attract labor power. In Russia, the problem was solved by means of an administrative state intervention which, quote, fixed, end quote, workers to specific factories. The measure was repealed only in 1956 when the growing complexity of Russian society rendered unenforceable old police bureaucratic methods, which tended to intensify socio-political tensions. Subsequently, less crude ways were used to control labor mobility. For example, concessions like seniority rights were introduced. Nevertheless, after 1956, the workers still remained tied to working for the same boss, the state, no matter what business, agricultural or industrial, he chose. Unlike the worker's Western counterpart, the Soviet worker could not choose freely from several capitalists competing on the market. This lack of competition and the fact that the plan fixed wages explains the very complex wage dynamic. It should be noted that the restoration of collective bargaining in 1947 had minimal effects, given the bureaucratic character of the unions. Footnote. De Leo's analysis, however, is very problematic. On page 159, De Leo writes that Soviet labor was, quote, labor not acquired on the market. It was not remunerated according to contract, but simply fed, end quote. One is dumbfounded to read such things. The labor force is perceived as a commodity, but as being totally extraneous to mercantile exchange. On page 170 and 177, De Leo alludes again to the lack of real state-worker negotiations, and it can be seen that the 1947 reform did not substantially change things. It does not occur to De Leo that such negotiations are absent, in real and not just in formal legalistic terms, because there is no negotiable exchange. Negotiations, when they are not a mere formality, as with state-kolkhoz relations, are an organic expression of mercantile exchange. End footnote. Wage determinations in the Soviet Union have always remained well within the limits of the system. They are certainly not comparable to their counterpart in the capitalist system, under similar historical conditions such as full employment and economic expansion. In 1957, the average real wage of a Russian worker was about $45 compared to about $55 for an Italian worker. Even if invisible wages are taken into account, which gives Russia an advantage since it does not generally produce very high-quality goods and services, a difference of 8% remains. Footnote. For this, see D'Angelo and Palladino. Concerning invisible wages, Levy writes, quote, the truth is, however, that no invisible wage, corresponding to free education and health care, which moreover also exist to a large extent in the Western countries in a similar manner or at minor cost to the inhabitants, is enough to raise the quality of Soviet life to the Western level, given the cost of consumer goods, end quote. On page 237, Levi supplies some statistics on the prices of consumer goods: $50 for a pair of women's shoes, $35 to $50 for a yard of wool fabric, $3.5 for a kilo of apples, etc. Also see the data concerning the scarcity of consumer goods. These prices are not exceptional. They are indicative of a price level for consumer goods higher than that of the West, due to the inability of the Soviet system to develop the secondary sector. End footnote. This gap widened from 1967 to the mid-60s, when salary increases in Italy exceeded those in the USSR. Italy, however, has not realized full employment and has a per capita gross national product inferior to the Soviet one. Footnote. In 1964, the USSR was in 5th place for per capita production, ahead of Italy, 8% difference, and Japan, 25% difference. See Levi. Levi also notes that among even the 7 largest industrial powers, the USSR is 3rd in investments, but considering also military spending, it is 1st in non-consumer related income. Within this investment structure, the primary sector occupies an extremely privileged position. End footnote. The difference between the two countries is rather clear. Although the Soviet Union has had decades of full employment, the Soviet Union's wage dynamics have remained contained. The 1962 minimum wage law that established the minimum wage at 40 to 50 rubles, parenthesis $40 to $50, according to a dubious rubles-dollar exchange rate, by no means resulted in a significant improvement of Soviet wages. Footnote: on this minimum wage reform, see DeLeo. On the truly miserable extent of this minimum wage, see Levi. After the minimum wage law was passed, there was, an irony of sorts, a wage freeze for 2 years. It should be emphasized that the ruble-dollar exchange rate was formally responsible for the worsening of the situation of the Russian worker. End footnote. Then there is the case of Czechoslovakia. Using 100 as the base for the level of per capita consumption and investment in the USSR in 1963, Czechoslovakia consumed more, 130, but invested less, 91, than the USSR. Yet Czechoslovakia also has economic planning and a low level of consumption in comparison to Western countries. In more or less the same period, the Czechoslovak standard of living was 2.5 times lower than that of France, while her per capita industrial production was 1.75 times greater. Similarly, Czech wages were below those of capitalist countries with modest industrial development. In conclusion, one could say that while in the West wages are controlled by unemployment or similar mechanisms, parenthesis, e.g. immigration from poor countries which creates an excess supply even in countries with full employment, in the USSR, the wage dynamic operates entirely on a non-Western level without using any of the above means. Full employment had been achieved in the 1930s, and rural emigration did not create an excess labor supply, as can be seen from the phenomenon of labor mobility re-emerging in the 1950s. Footnote: Levi notes how, in 1959, the rate of unemployment was 2.6% of the labor force. This unemployment is due to those workers who quit their jobs, knowing that other and perhaps better jobs were available. This suggests that there was a considerable excess of labor, quote, demand. In itself, an index of 2.6% for non-structural unemployment is, as Levi states, rather high. However, this index takes on an even greater significance when one considers the attempted suppression of labor mobility by the Soviet system, even after the repeal of the penal law in 1956. We must, however, reject D'Angelo and Palladino's theory, which suggests that the low productivity of Soviet labor implies the existence of hidden unemployment. When there is a scarcity of labor demand, unemployment, both hidden and open, exists, but when there is an excessive labor demand, one cannot speak of unemployment. Certainly, labor productivity in the Soviet Union is low relative to that of the West, but this is due to the characteristics of a system that has planned a relatively extensive type of development. On the basis of this type of development, we do not have unemployment but a scarcity of labor power. This has perhaps resulted in a tendency by Soviet managers to compete for labor power. However, this competition, unlike similar phenomena in a capitalist system, has not led to a rise in real wages. Instead, Soviet managers competed with each other by hoarding workers. This could only not occur in a system where production quotas must be fulfilled and where there is no labor market. End footnote. A capitalist economy under similar circumstances of full employment and productive development would have experienced a per capita wage boom instead of the static levels obtained in Russia. The only explanation lies in the fact that in the USSR, the old principle according to which, when two capitalists seek a worker, wages go up, is not operative. In other words, the law of supply and demand does not exist in the Soviet system. To talk about, quote, wages, end quote, in the USSR is only a matter of linguistic convenience. Both Ritzi and Hilferding seem to have been correct when Ritzi and Hilferding characterized wages as being the non-mercantile mechanism within the plan which allows the workers to reconstitute their labor power. In our system, wages also serve to regenerate workers' labor power. This is true of every antagonistic system. What must be emphasized is that in the capitalist system, it is the market that fixes the price of labor power at a certain level according to spontaneous and blind laws. In the USSR, on the other hand, the plan fulfills this function according to its objectives. This does not happen arbitrarily, but according to the laws that govern the Soviet economy, which determine the choices of the plan. First among all these laws is that of unequal development, giving priority to the capital goods sector at the expense of the secondary consumer goods sector. Consumption and wages consequently appear much lower than in the West. We can now clarify the fundamental tendencies determining the wage fluctuations of the Russian worker. The wage of the Western worker fluctuates, as Marx has shown, between a minimum necessary for biological life and a maximum close to a level that would threaten expanded reproduction, depress the rate of profit, and so on. For the USSR, the minimum limit is the same, while the maximum limit is established by the needs of expanded reproduction. However, this reproduction is not reproduction of exchange value and surplus value based on the market as in the West, but predominantly the reproduction of use values. Priority is given to the capital goods sector in a way that is quantitatively and qualitatively different from the West, contrary to the West, in which the development of the secondary sector promotes the primary sector. The USSR sees the development of the secondary sector as a hindrance to the productive capacity of the primary capital goods sector. Its ideal, impossible to realize, would be to suppress the production of consumer goods. Given this premise, it follows that the maximum level to which wages may rise is much lower than that of advanced capitalist countries, since higher real wages would necessitate a major production of consumer goods. Theoretically, the system would increase consumption and real wages and carry them to the Western level through foreign trade, selling capital goods for consumer goods. But Russian foreign trade before 1965 had minor importance for an economy of its complexity. There were two reasons for this. First, the Soviets justly feared integrating themselves firmly into the imperialist world market, rightly fearing the political and economic stirrings attached to such integration. Secondly, capital goods, in fact, Soviet products in general, are inferior in quality to those of the West and would not compete very favorably on the market. Although the USSR has considerable wealth in the form of raw materials, these are tied to local industries or have a military strategic importance that would obviously limit trade. Having established that the Soviet wage is not a capitalist category, we might pose an even more fundamental question. Can the Russian proletariat be considered, quote, workers, end quote, in the Marxist sense? For Marx, workers produce surplus product in the specific form of surplus value, and their labor power assumes the commodity form. The Soviet worker, however, produces surplus product and not surplus value. Moreover, there is no wage relation determined by a mercantile exchange between himself and the state. Technically speaking, a new term should be used, but since what is important is the content and not so much the form, it is possible to speak of the Russian proletariat as workers, while keeping in mind the distinction between the capitalist market economy and the Soviet one. If from the economic structural viewpoint, the Soviet and the Western proletariat differ, from the political viewpoint, their interests converge. But these classes are fundamental to the two systems and are exploited by the two systems, but one can only liberate themselves through a socialist revolution. Both can only liberate themselves through a socialist revolution. Although their situation is not identical, there is enough similarity to allow for a potential convergence and to justify calling them both proletarian classes. We will later outline some hypotheses on the future political attitude of the Russian workers. One thing, however, is certain. The Russian workers have reached a point where they reject the Soviet system but cannot solve their problems through capitalism. There's a footnote I missed. On this point, Marx seems to oscillate a bit. In the first place, he states that it is labor productivity that created exchange value. However, at the end of this passage, he says that he will have to return to the argument. He would do this some years later in the work cited above. Marx will do this by assuming a definite and suitable position on the analysis of capitalism as a system based on the production of surplus value. Surplus value is here a parameter of productivity and therefore of exchange. Section 8. Bordiga's thesis. The previous section clearly shows that the USSR is not a capitalist country, but to what extent are the capitalist and Soviet systems similar? According to Bordiga, the law of the falling rate of profit operates in the Soviet economy. As proof, Bordiga points to Stalin's continuous calls for increases in productivity, which Bordiga argues could not be explained otherwise. Footnote. See Bordiga, Dialogue avec Stalin. I believe that is a dialogue with Stalin, which is on Marxist.org, I believe. Where am I? Back to the end footnote. On the contrary, the productivity push can be explained otherwise. The USSR was forced to industrialize under the most difficult conditions. The USSR faced the danger of imperialist aggression before 1940, international hostility after 1947, and the Cold War during its reconstruction. Furthermore, the law cannot operate because its components surplus value, an economy dominated by the market, the increasing organic composition of capital, and falling prices do not obtain in Russia. We can perhaps speak of a, quote, law of the falling rate of accumulation, end quote, but in the end this exercise would only serve to show superficial similarities between the two systems. Footnote, on this see Mink, who, however, denies the existence of the law even in a, quote, modified, end quote, form. End footnote. Similar arguments are also valid for the law of the equalization of the rate of profit, a law which presumes the existence of an anarchic interaction of several capitals on the market. It would also be incorrect to think that the law could operate in Russia through the plan. Profit as a mercantile capitalist category does not exist in the plan. The antagonisms and dysfunctions of the Russian economy are not, we repeat, phenomena like the competition among several capitals on the market in search of maximum profit. The equal distribution of resources and the surplus product is determined by the plan, and in most cases, the distribution is unequal. As has been noted, the primary sector grows at the expense of the secondary sector, while some enterprises produce at a loss for long periods of time. If that was the case, I don't know, I was just wondering to myself, I'm just thinking out loud right now, it's like, if what would it mean for an enterprise producing in a non-market setting to be producing at a loss? Footnote. Very often, in fact, the plan decrees that some businesses must produce at a loss. Businesses, that's the word being used. Must produce at a loss. See Alec Nova, The Soviet Economy, and Economic Rationality in Soviet Politics, or Was Stalin Really Necessary?, published in 1964. This implies that the plan stipulates losses as well as gains. The equalization of profit is therefore not an objective of the plan. Parenthesis, by profit we mean surplus product. In parenthesis. How would you equalize surplus product? That's a weird idea. I don't know. Sorry, I'm talking too much. As for the law of value, it has been adequately shown that the law of value cannot operate in an economy dominated by the plan and by collective property. Footnote. On this, see Preobrazhensky, The New Economics, published in English in 1965. Bruce, The Market in a Socialist Economy, published in 1972. Parenthesis, which, however, contradicts itself by re-evaluating the mercantile categories and thereby emptying its preceding arguments of their content. See Guevara, Opsite Sweezy, The Theory of Capitalist Development, published in 1962. This is without doubt Marx and Engels' opinion, which even the, quote, economic revisionist, end quote, Ota Sik admits. See Plan and Market under Socialism. Preobrazhensky believes that the basis of the law of value is reduced where commodities in the market do not exist or are of secondary importance. Parenthesis, as is the case with the Soviet Union. End footnote. Furthermore, the plan has developed on the ruin of the law of value in the sense that there has been a transfer of value from the agricultural to the industrial sector, a transfer that could also occur in oligopolistic capitalism, but under a market system rather than a plan. Footnote. Bordiga contradicts himself on this point. In L'économie soviétique de la révolution à nos jours, in Programme communiste, when Bordiga admits that there was a drainage of value, parenthesis, by means other than exchange equivalents, end parenthesis, to the detriment of agriculture. As for evidence of the law of value, there is Stalin's declaration in Economic Problems of Socialism. However, Stalin limits the law of value to city-country relations and maintains that the law of value operates in only a limited fashion, subordinated to the plan, something that does not exist in capitalism, and is a transitory residue. However, Stalin's statements are not correct, as even Bordiga admits. This is evident by the exploitation of the countryside. It seems that in 1951, Stalin wanted to ideologically conceal the persistent robbery of the countryside behind the parameters of the, quote, law of value, end quote. Moreover, in his tactical turns, Stalin is not even consistent, since in 1937, Stalin admitted the fact that industry was being built at the expense of agriculture. See his problems of Stalin's problems of Leninism. End footnote. In particular, industry being more amenable to combination can impoverish the agricultural sector by the imposition of cartel prices. This happens only within a market where the, quote, producers, end quote, compete for the highest profits. Thus, Marx in the Grundrisse had noted the phenomenon of unequal exchange, although he made no specific reference to the relations between the country and city in 1957 to 58. In the Soviet Union, however, the exploitation of the countryside occurs according to the dictates of the plan and independently of any mercantile criteria, e.g., when the kolkhoz had to cede their goods to the state, often at a loss, parenthesis, below cost, end parenthesis, on the complicated process of agricultural price variations before 1965. See Nova, The Soviet Economy, page 136. The fact that the law of equalization operates with exceptions in an oligopolistic economy does not disprove the law's validity, since every economic law is tendential. In this case, The law is operative only in the leading and dominant sector of the system, i.e. the oligopoly sector. Small and medium businesses, as well as agriculture, do fall under the equalization law. Do not fall under the equalization law. Do not fall under the equalization law. See Silos Labini oligopoly. End footnote. As for the causes of capitalist economic crises, it is sufficient to note that whichever theory appears applicable to a capitalist society is inapplicable to the Soviet one. Soviet crises cannot derive from the falling rate of profit. Soviet crises cannot derive from the falling rate of profit. Footnote. This is the thesis of Dobb in his Political Economy and Capitalism, published in 1937, recently followed by Negri. End footnote. Where am I? Soviet crises cannot derive from the falling rate of profit, nor from overproduction, nor from unrealized surplus value. To repeat, there cannot be overproduction in Russia because there is no production of surplus value. This does not conflict with the previously mentioned case of the unsold shoes. Although the unsold shoes represent a waste of values, they certainly did not precipitate a crisis of overproduction, as would have happened under capitalism. The wasted use value here differs from the production of an excess of exchange value, and unrealized surplus value of the capitalist system. This is not to say that the Soviet system escapes crises and dysfunctions. Rather, its crises and dysfunctions have a different genesis and move according to different dynamics than those of a capitalist system. For these reasons, we understand better than a rather embarrassed Bordiga why the Great Crisis of 1929 did not spread to the USSR. Such a capitalist crisis could not extend itself to an economy having very different dynamics and contradictions. Although this is not the place to criticize Bordiga point by point, we can glance at one of his major arguments, i.e. that the Soviet system represents a form of monopoly state capitalism. Footnote. Bordiga in fact maintains that the Soviet Union was not affected by the 1929 crisis for the following three reasons. 1. Capitalist crises are crises of overproduction, and in Russia there was a large zone of consumption yet to be satisfied. I mean, that assumes that the amount of consumption to be satisfied had money to back it up. 2. The Soviet Union was a young country and therefore strong. 3. The Soviet Union was isolated from the world market. See Bordiga Dialogato coi morti. To the first argument, we can respond by saying that the presence of unsatisfied needs does not exclude the possibility of a crisis, since the latter presents itself on the phenomenological level as a crisis of a, quote, effective demand, end quote. The second argument is little more than a joke if for young countries is meant backward countries with little technical capital and very few skilled workers. On the other hand, the, quote, very young, end quote, Russian capitalist economy had its first economic crisis in 1873, when there were only some, quote, very young, end quote, sectors. Note the year 1873, the year of the great capitalist crisis. See Cerroni, Le origini del socialismo in Russia. Maybe Russia. Published in Rome in 1965. To the third argument, we can respond that in general the capitalist crises also hit the marginal and backward countries. See Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory, Volume 2. And Maurice Dobbs, Studies in the Development of Capitalism, published in 1963. It was only a matter of the intensity and immediacy of the crisis. In Russia, however, from 1929 on, there was an exceptional development. According to Bordiga, the USSR was increasing its trade at the West and consequently had to introduce the principles of production for exchange. Marx, of course, was familiar with the dynamics governing the exchange relations between capitalist and non-capitalist economies. There was no doubt in his mind that African aborigines do not become capitalists by trading sporadically with Europeans. Footnote, see Marx Capital Volume 2, where it is noted that an exchange between capitalist and non-capitalist economies can very well exist on the world market. In Volume 3, he notes that the use of violence by the English against the primitive Indian communities after the subjection of India and the latter's connection through England to the world market. Nevertheless, in spite of the violence, the erosion of the old productive relations, which did not become perfectly capitalist through their incorporation into the world market, took place slowly. Along the same lines, see Rosa Luxemburg, The Accumulation of Capital, where Luxemburg speaks of the prolonged attempts by the French to impose new capitalist relations on occupied Algeria. In other words, it is not enough to conquer a country and substitute their own goods and markets to those that already exist. A limited and sporadic exchange of goods exists even in pre-capitalist systems. It is also necessary that a particular economy adjust, quote, internally, end quote, to the laws of capital, hence the use of violence to facilitate a transition that on the merely economic level would be much slower. End footnote. There was no doubt in Marx's mind that African aborigines do not become capitalists by trading sporadically with Europeans. The interaction between diverse economies in which the stronger imposes itself and integrates the other occurs over a long period of time, unless political force is used. Where the latter is not employed, there must be a sufficient volume of trade with the capitalist market in order to force the non-capitalist economy to adapt to capitalist laws. Footnote, there is no doubt that the world market tends to incorporate everything. The Russians understood this very well. See Preobrazhensky's The New Economics and Baikov. These conditions did not hold true for Russia before 1965. Between 1946 and 1961, the years considered by Bordiga, despite the fact that foreign trade did rise absolutely, it remained rather modest in relation to the total Russian production. Footnote: During 1930 to 31, the Russians slightly increased their trade, though this never reached large dimensions, in order to take advantage of some rather lucrative deals for the buyers provided by the Great Crisis. Russia thus profited from the enormous difficulties of the capitalist countries. However, aside from this brief period, trade has not been all that large. On this, see Baikov. From 1932 to 1946, trade progressively decreased. After 1946, it notably increased until 1961. Bordiga's data end with 1961. Even so, the main tenor of the trade, relative to the Russian gross national product, is modest. 10.6 billion rubles in 1961 against an industrial production of 160 billion, about 3/5 of the gross national product. This is 1/5 of industrial production and 1/25 of the gross national product, a very modest amount. After 1961, Russian foreign commerce increased. See Yali, Imperialism in the 70s. New York, 1973. But so did the gross national product, 71% from 1960 to 1968, according to data of the Soviet agency Novosti. Thus, there was no real substantial or, quote, spectacular change before the 1965 reform. Even now, Russia appears to be a, quote, autarkic, end quote, country, although some factors have emerged that could lead us to think of future reversals of this tendency. End footnote. After 1965, with the Kosygin reforms, mercantile categories assumed more importance, though by no means dominant importance, since mercantile categories were still subordinate to the plan. This apparent turn was due mainly to endogenous causes, the pressure of internal contradictions, and less so to the laws of the capitalist world market. One second. Bettelheim's analysis is similar to Bourdiga's, although it shows more finesse. We will limit ourselves here to one observation. He does not maintain that the alienation of the Soviet state from the broad masses proves that it constitutes an apparatus of power in the hands of a new state bourgeoisie. Footnote, see Bettelheim's articles in Bettelheim and Sweezy, The Transition to Socialism, 1971. End footnote. Instead, the alienation discloses the antagonistic, not necessarily capitalist class character of the USSR. The relations between state and society in Russia is quite different than in the West. If there is exploitation, it obtains within the framework of a new and different model. As for Bettelheim's claim that the bureaucracy can only be an instrument of another class, Bettelheim is basing his judgment on the Western experience, which is by no means universal. It is by no means inconceivable that the bureaucracy becomes autonomous, appropriates the productive apparatus, and transforms itself into a class. Perhaps a new term is needed to grasp this new reality. In any case, the problem is not one of labels but of meaning. The Soviet bureaucracy is not equivalent to Western state bureaucracies, because the former, as a new class, operates according to a rather different logic. Section 9. The antagonistic bracket, but not capitalist end bracket, class character of the USSR. Marx drew attention to the historical superstructural character of capitalism, i.e. the dialectical separation between political and economic life, between citoyen and bourgeois, between the state and the economic structure. Footnote. On this, see Marx on the Jewish question. This theme has been elaborated by Della Volpa and his school. See Della Volpa, Umanismo Positivo ed Emancipazione Marxista, and La Libertà Comunista. End footnote. Within this dialectical relation, state intervention in the economy is one of the constant characteristics of all capitalist development. Footnote. See, for example, Sweezy's Theory of Capitalist Development. End footnote. The reason for this separation, parenthesis, that does not exist in the USSR where political and economic power is fused, end parenthesis, lies in the particular characteristics of capitalist ownership and its anarchic competitive nature. When single capitalists or managers of small businesses or large monopolies act in their own interests, struggling against other capitalists or other branches of the economy, an organ is required to mediate the internal conflicts of the system for the capitalist as a whole. This organ is the state. Obviously, this does not mean that the bourgeois state performs an interclass function. On the contrary, by mediating particular antagonisms among capitalists and groups of capitalists, the state permits the system, considered as a whole, to persist and to develop, raising its anarchy and contradictions to a higher level. In this sense, the state performs an essential capitalist function. On the other hand, it is beyond the scope of the state's function to eliminate anarchy. To do so would mean that the capitalist would have to act not for profit but for the collective interest in a coordinated, planned manner. This obviously contradicts the very nature of the state and of the bourgeois class. The most the state can do on the economic as well as the judicial and political level is to mitigate certain effects of anarchy and to channel them into forms that will not destroy the market and society. Perhaps an example will clarify our point. Marx refers to a revealing case in which a group of industrialists in Staffordshire presented a petition to the English Parliament. The industrialists had begun questioning the viability of a system that was working its base, the working class, to utter exhaustion. The working day had by now reached the intolerable length of 16 hours. If measures were not taken to limit the working day, the system may have collapsed as laborers collapsed or be overthrown by a workers' revolution. The majority of industrialists, however, opposed a unilateral reduction which they feared would cut profits and precipitate bankruptcy. The state did intervene with the 10-hour law, overruling opposition from the majority of the capitalists, and saved the system. Footnote. It has been said that the 10-hour law was essentially a Tory revenge against the Whigs rather than a victory of the working class. See Marx's inaugural address of the International Workingmen's Association in the First International and After. The book, The First International and After. Published in 1974. Such elements were undoubtedly present in the genesis of the law, but if we reread Marx in Capital Volume 1, page 281, and if we take into account the law's objective significance in the functioning of the system, then it is clear that our interpretation remains valid. Here, as in other cases, a workers' victory not followed by any revolutionary developments modernized the system in the sense desired by the enlightened entrepreneurs of Staffordshire. End footnote. In effect, the English parliamentary movement In effect, the English Parliament momentarily went against the short-term interests of the capitalists in favor of their long-term interests, acting as the, quote, collective conscience of capital, end quote. The state imposed the state self on single capitalists. The state forced single capitalists to rationalize and modernize exploitation, to aim more at relative rather than absolute surplus value. As can be seen, then, the dialectical interplay between the political and economic levels derives from the competitive and anarchic character of capitalist ownership. This dialectical separation does not obtain when the economy is governed from above by a plan. Instead, there is a broad fusion of the state with the economy. Whereas in the West, the state and state enterprises are at the service of an autonomous and distinct class and do not have basic interests independent of it, in Russia the state has absorbed the productive apparatus and governs the economy. This explains the difference in the relationship between the state and the productive apparatus in the Soviet and capitalist systems. Section 10. Privatist residues in the USSR. The Soviet reality must be considered in light of the celebrated Marxist teaching found in the Grundrisse. Footnote. See Marx Grundrisse. In other work, Marx writes, quote, ... No hard and fast abstract lines can be drawn between the epochs of social history any more than between the epochs of geological history, end quote. Marx. Marx writes that if in a given society there are several types of productive relations, and according to Marx this is the rule, then one must specify the dominant relation in order to uncover the fundamental socio-economic laws of the society. There is no doubt that in Russia there are residues of private ownership. This point is emphasized by Bordiga. Footnote. See Bordiga Dialogato coi morti. End footnote. This would include small units of agricultural production representing only 4% of the arable land, small artisan production, and the construction of private housing. Footnote. In the middle of the 1960s, Russian land was divided in the following manner: 4% peasant plots, 31% sovkhoz, 65% kolkhoz. The data furnished by Gotti, published in 1967, or for 1967, seem to give a further increase to the sovkhoz section. According to Wikipedia, the sovkhoz was a form of state-owned farm in the Soviet Union. It usually contrasted with the kolkhoz, which is a collective-owned farm. Just as the members of the kolkhoz were called, quote, kolkhozniks or kolkhozniki, the workers of a sovkhoz were called sovkhozniki. End footnote. Back to the text. Where am I? End footnote. Where was the last footnote? Okay. This will include small units of agricultural production representing only 4% of the arable land, small artisan production, and the construction of private housing. The first two cases, however, represent residues of simple mercantile production. They do not exploit labor power, nor are they involved in expanded reproduction. In both cases, the principle governing the process of production is commodity money commodity, production for consumption and not for profit as in capitalism. We need hardly add that its economic importance is not comparable to that of the state-owned sectors of the economy. Footnote. At best, footnote. This is a very well-known... Sorry, I missed a footnote. That's why I'm kind of stumbling here. The footnote that I missed says, this is very well-known fact. See, for example, Prokopovich, Story dell'Economia del URSS, which states that on the basis of the Soviets' own data, the Kolkhozian daily wage during the Stalin era approximated 10 cents at present rates. Hence, the essential character of kolkhoz production, without its starvation, would have been rampant. End footnote. In both cases, the principle governing the process of production is commodity money commodity. Next footnote. At best, plot production, while enjoying an exceptional labor productivity, fluctuates between 1/6 and 1/7 of agricultural production. See, for example, Prokopovich, and for more recent data, Levi, where the percentage is a little more than 1/6, 17%. End footnote. As for the construction of private housing, through cooperatives that often take on, quote, free workers, end quote, it is allowed only for purposes of direct consumption. A different case is that of the collectives in charge of distribution. These are, in spite of their name, real state enterprises without any autonomy relative to the plan. They figure in the state budget, and their duties are classified and dealt with as subordinate to the state, even from the judicial economic viewpoint. Footnote. See Nova, the Soviet economy. End footnote. The case of the kolkhoz is much more complex. It is a hybrid between state and private or associate property, a real puzzle. What is clear is that a historical compromise lies at the base of this institution, i.e., it adjusts to the privatistic mentality of the farmers without substantially touching the centralist bureaucratic social principles of the state plan. In other words, the state made propagandistic concessions in order to then reintegrate them into the state economy. Such reintegration has reached the point where the differences between the kolkhoz and the state sovkhoz are relatively secondary and minor. The more relevant privatistic elements of the kolkhoz refer to the private plots. The kolkhoz owns animals, productive instruments, and since 1958, tractors, but not the land. But these forms of ownership are largely meaningless. Since they have no real autonomy, they are closely tied to the central plan. For its internal organization, it should be democratic, the leaders are supposed to be elected from below, It is unlikely, however, that there is any real democracy. Russia is a profoundly undemocratic state, in the sense of workers' democracy, and it is absurd to think that the countryside could be exempted from this phenomenon. The violation of the kolkhoz democracy and the massive intervention of the state are well-known facts. One need only think of the problems of the labor squads. In 1950, the continued transformation of the kolkhoz into sovkhoz, the concentration of the kolkhoz into larger units, the transfer of the personnel, quote, the faithful, end quote, from the SMT, machine tractor stations, to the kolkhoz in 1958, and the campaign against plainsmen, Erbisti, in 1962. The state tractor station, the machine tractor station, according to Wikipedia. The machine tractor station was a state enterprise for ownership and maintenance of agricultural machinery that were used in kolkhozy, collective farms operated by the government. Each MTS was responsible for around 40 kolkhozy. The first ever MTS was organized in the Odessa Oblast. MTSs were introduced in 1928 as a shared resource of scarce agricultural machinery and technical personnel. William Taubman, Khrushchev's biographer, described them as follows, quote, as the name implies, the machine tractor station were rural agencies that supplied collective farms with agricultural machinery and people to run it. The machine tractor stations were set up in the late 1920s and early 1930s when the kolkhozy were too weak and disorganized to manage the kolkhozy's own equipment. Ideologically, collective farms were a, quote, lesser, end quote, form of property, since theoretically the collective farms belonged to the collective rather than the state as a whole. Hence, it would not do to have them own part of the, quote, means of production, end quote. Politically, the new collective farms into which so many peasants were dragooned were unreliable. So the MTS also served as a party and police stronghold in the countryside, end quote. William Taubman. The main units of the machine tractor stations were tractor brigades and automobile brigades, which performed the corresponding agricultural work. The machine tractor stations was paid with a share of the agricultural product called natural payment. Over time, The machine tractor stations became an instrument of transferring the agricultural production from kolkhozy to sovkhozy of the state. 75,000 tractors had been supplied by MTSs to Soviet collective farms by 1932, and in 1933 the natural payment constituted about 20% of the product and continued to grow. They existed as independent interkolkhoz service until 1958, when the machinery was transferred to the farms and the machine tractor stations transformed into machinery service stations, which were still known under the old name for a longer time. In 1972, these machinery service stations were further renamed Regional Association, quote, Selkhoztechnika, an abbreviation for agricultural machinery. In post-Soviet Russia, some economists expressed ideas about the revival of machine tractor stations to help small independent farmers. So that's the machine tractor station. Turn back to the text. All this culminated in the construction of bureaucratic organs of control and direction emanating from the party that negated the timid advances of the preceding years. Footnote. On these points, see especially Prokopovich, D'Angelo and Palladino, Miller and others, Communist Economy Under Change. It is particularly interesting to note that the state has concentrated the kolkhoz from 252,000 in 1950 to 36,900 in 1965. In 1962, the kolkhoz was subordinated to the state in a rather more grave and rigid manner than in the past. From 1954 to 1965, the sovkhoz have increased, possessing at present 47% of the arable land as opposed to 13% in 1954. End footnote. One could object that the state still exchanges with the kolkhoz for the latter's produce, as opposed to the sovkhoz, where the produce is immediately given as state property. This mercantile exchange, however, is totally illusory, since the state is free to set prices outside of any mercantile criteria. The price is usually very low and often below the costs of production. This has always been the main source of the farmers' opposition to the Soviet power. Footnote. It seems that Bordiga, in L'Économie soviétique, overemphasizes the juridical formal character of the exchange, the contract that exists between the state and the kolkhoz. When one of the parties establishes prices outside of any capitalist mercantile criterion and forces the other party to cede their goods below cost, then we do not have a capitalist mercantile exchange. End footnote. The judicial formal character of the exchange merely hides an administrative appropriation of the surplus by the bureaucracy. As for the kolkhoz, they must make up for this appropriation by selling the remainder of the produce on the kolkhoz free market. As late as 1961, when the worst aspects of Stalinism no longer existed, the kolkhoz still suffered a loss of 1 to 2 billion rubles from their, quote, sales, end quote, to the state. Loss being defined as the difference between the cost of production and the price. Footnote. See Gadi or Gaddy. End footnote. The readjustment of the prices by the government in 1961 to 62 does not seem to have ameliorated the situation, and the March 1965 price level remained, as far as is known, lower than most of the free kolkhoz market. Footnote. Quote, in spite of everything, for a good part of the enterprises, not even these new prices managed to cover the cost that in some cases had been increased. End quote. See also Levy, page 131. I don't know. Or maybe it's Levi. Levi notes that in 1962, Soviet statistics and Khrushchev himself admitted that the kolkhozs were forced to, quote, sell, end quote, at a loss that often exceeded 50% of the cost of production. After Khrushchev's famous speech, the price of meat rose 35%. See Miller's Communist Society, page 42. Yet the losses prior to the price rise were 49% for beef, 43% for pork, and 62% for poultry. This retouching does not, therefore, raise the price to an adequate level, let alone a mercantile level. End footnote. Thus, the meat on the kolkhoz free market cost 180 rubles, milk 23.4 rubles, potatoes 13.5 rubles, and vegetables 21.6 rubles. On the other hand, the state pays 8 rubles for vegetables, 15.6 for milk, 110.3 for beef, 136.3 for pork, and 6.9 for potatoes. Footnote. See Gotti, page 343 to 344. It should be noted that in the USSR there are two markets of agricultural products where the prices are determined by, quote, mercantile, end quote, criteria. One is managed by the state cooperatives that buy the kolkhoz surplus. The other is the so-called kolkhoz free market, to which is added a part of the production of the small plots. The data given in the text refers to the fish market. For a further explanation encouraging the differences between the two types of market, see Gotti, page 326. It should also be noted that on the free market, the influence of the state cooperatives has a depressing effect on prices. It is a well-known fact that the market prices are higher than those set by the state. End footnote. When one considers that Khrushchev's policies tended to push up prices on the kolkhoz market through its restriction, the difference is very clear. This explains why the people in the kolkhoz insisted that the part of the produce absorbed by the state be reduced to a minimum relative to the market quota. Footnote. In fact, the quota of goods absorbed by the state, which unilaterally fixes the prices, negotiations are, as we shall see, only apparent, if clearly dominant. The quota that goes to the free kolkhoz market is, however, still important, in spite of being smaller. It allows the kolkhoz to replenish its supplies and thus make up for their submission to the state's extortion. In fact, Schwartz notes that in the past the relatively small amount of produce sold on the free market brought much more income than the much larger amount delivered to the state. End footnote. The Soviet state in turn responded by enforcing the opposite position, thereby exacerbating the tendencies of the Stalin era, even though they had been generally repudiated after his death. Thus, while the kolkhoz market sold 18.1% of the food products destined for the non-rural population in 1950, this proportion fell to 7.1% in 1960 and 4.9% in 1967. Footnote. This data refers to the kolkhoz market and not to the free market. Moreover, the state cooperatives also sell the small kolkhoz stocks that, as we shall see, have considerable economic importance. The state therefore tries to control the production of the plots through the cooperatives, and where the cooperatives do not intervene, by simply stifling the kolkhoz market. The produce of the small plot is, as suggested by the data, being shifted from the kolkhoz market to the free market, which is controlled by the state cooperatives, who pick up a part of the income of whatever is sold. End footnote. All this proves how, behind the apparent act of sale, there lies a bureaucratic appropriation altogether independent of any mercantile criteria. The state simply fixes prices according to the needs of the plan at a level clearly lower than that of the market, and quite often lower than the costs of production. In substance, the state does not buy anything. The power relation is such that the kolkhoz must give to the state what the state orders it to produce on the state's conditions. It can therefore be said that the state is the boss of the kolkhoz, whose organizational and financial management is completely subordinated to the plan. The prerequisites of mercantile exchange, the passage of property between autonomous productive subjects or units, are completely lacking. Thus, it follows that there is nothing private about the kolkhoz enterprises. They are functionally integrated into the planned economy, guided by the state and based on definitely non-capitalist principles. This is confirmed by the fact that farmers have always preferred to work in their own plots, the kolkhoz garden, as opposed to the kolkhoz proper. Footnote. This can be deduced from the previously furnished data. 4% of the cultivated land produces 1/7 to 1/6 of the total production, despite the technical backwardness of the labor process. Even in 1939 to 40, the Soviet state had to use severe measures against the kolkhozians who spurned work on the collectivized areas in order to work their own plots. Things have not changed in the post-Stalin era. As we have seen, the plots continue to produce 17% of agricultural production in spite of their always modest range. See Nova, page 45, Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory, Volume 2, page 581, Miller, page 39, and Gotti, page 125 to 126. The phenomenon has been the object of a series of Russian literary works, Matryona's House by Solzhenitsyn, in Stories and Prose Poems, published in 1971, and One Day in the, quote, New Life, end quote, by Abramov, which often indirectly provide a series of interesting economic insights. Gotti admits that labor productivity is rather low on the collectivized enterprises, but refuses to recognize the higher plot productivity, even though this is evident in his own data. Perhaps it is true that the labor force employed on the plot is combined with a greater abundance of land, but this is counterbalanced by the clear difference in mechanization. Gotti admits that the kolkhozians work in the plots, quote, without saving of time or energy, end quote, and that the system drove them towards small mercantile production, to which they apply themselves, quote, with particular attention, end quote. Now, it doesn't take much to understand the, quote, obligation and attention, end quote, are fundamental constitutive elements of productivity, elements that we find on the plots but not in the collectivized enterprises. Nor objectively could things have been much different given the starvation wages of the Stalin era that drove the kolkhozians to squeeze their plots to the maximum in order to maintain a very modest standard of living. End footnote. This says a lot about the farmers' opinions of kolkhoz democracy, which was supposed to have integrated them into the enterprise, and of the state kolkhoz, quote, mercantile exchanges. In reality, the farmers have always behaved as alienated state employees, not as, quote, cooperators interested in the development of quote, their business. The intricate debates concerning the nature of the kolkhoz property have never appealed to them. Undoubtedly, there were zigzags in the state-kolkhoz relationship. For example, in the years following Stalin's death, some of the more brutal forms of exploitation and bureaucratic control were either eliminated or mitigated. There were some price changes, though they never even approached the quote, mercantile end quote, level, and some weak attempts at decentralization. The effect of these measures should not be exaggerated. On the whole, things changed very little, as will become evident when we discuss the events of 1965 to 66. It should be added that many of these measures were never carried out. The substitution of consignment plans for production plans still left the state as arbiter of the things to be consigned, and therefore by extension of the things to be produced. Even the 1955 reform was particularly ignored, as Khrushchev himself admitted. The same thing can be said of the 1958 reform that formally abolished the obligatory stockpile. For this stockpile, the kolkhoz had to surrender large portions of their produce at ridiculously low prices. This is the way a pro-Soviet author like Gatti writes about the Gatti, I think it's Gatti, actually, writes about the 1958 reform. Quote, formally abolished in 1958, the stockpiling, in fact, remained in force as is almost inevitable in an economy in which acquisitions are organized and planned, ... It is also true that, at least until 1965, negotiations between the collecting agencies and the enterprises were often reduced to a fiction, and enterprises were practically forced to accept the demands that the plan imposed. Bureaucratic to the extreme, the collecting agencies continued to have as their sole preoccupation the procurement for the state of the largest possible quantity of produce, without taking into account the effective potential, internal needs, or interests of the individual enterprises. End quote. Thus, post-Stalinist reforms did not really change very much. Moreover, during the 1958 to 62 period, the state undertook a series of incursions into the agrarian economy that would be absolutely unthinkable in a capitalist mercantile system. It is almost as if the state wanted to remove any doubt about who is the real boss in the countryside. Footnote. It is ridiculous for Gatti to maintain that certain transformations from kolkhoz to sovkhoz were in response to demands from below, in a system where every such demand is regularly suffocated. If such demands ever succeed, it is because the people at the top have an interest in their success. But given the total lack of kolkhozian democracy and the tendency of the agricultural workers, quote, to shut themselves up, end quote, within their own plots, it appears absurd to maintain that they really wanted a transformation of kolkhoz into sovkhoz. After all, this implies an even greater subordination, already quite notable in the kolkhoz, to the state. Gatti seems to accept the Soviet propaganda without noticing how it does not fit in the context of his own work. Gatti is an honest Sovietophile who, on the one hand, believes in the, quote, fatherland, end quote, of socialism, and on the other, gives us a series of data, testimony, and admissions that are on the whole rather depressing. End footnote. In the private sector, illegal speculation or the black market occupies a special place. This is a well-diffused phenomenon, as can be seen by the frequent campaigns of the Soviet state against economic crimes for which the death penalty is meted out in extreme cases. Nevertheless, in a system as centralized and authoritarian as the Russian, it is difficult to suppose, and no one seems to support such a supposition, that the black market has supplanted the official means of distribution. In fact, the black market has a very subsidiary role, but even here there are no capitalist productive relations. Many people think that every private activity of a speculative character, even theft and piracy, is to be equated with capitalism. The black market functions roughly as follows. The plan's dysfunction results in its failure to produce consumer goods in sufficient quantity or quality. Thus, certain products will be in great demand. The factory managers that produce these goods illegally take a certain quantity of these goods from the state stock and send them, either directly or through intermediaries, to the black market. These managers do not invest capital, nor do these managers buy labor power with the aim of producing and realizing surplus value for purposes of reinvestment as well as individual enrichment. In other words, these managers are not properly capitalists, but rather thieves. Thus, although the black market has a private character, in the sense that those people who distribute goods through the black market do so for private gain, is not capitalist in the more rigorous sense of the word. The question arises here concerning the total weight of the private sector in the USSR. Soviet statistics tend to reduce it to a minimum, but it is obvious that they underestimate the phenomenon, particularly when it comes to the black market. The most optimistic estimates are Miller's, who says that it represents about 1/4 of the total productive and distributive activity in the USSR. Footnote. See Miller. In her analysis, Miller does not consider the value of the products of the USSR exports in the world market, which according to Stalin in his Economic Problems of Socialism should be considered as commodities. In Marx, a similar idea can be found in Capital Volume 2, page 113. End footnote. We would estimate it at a little less than 25%. For polemical reasons, Miller tends to overestimate its weight, especially in the case of the black market, which, as stated earlier, cannot but have a subsidiary character. Given this estimate, there can be no doubt that on the whole the state is still the dominant force, and Miller agrees with this. This is true not only because the state manages by itself the remaining 3/4 of the economic activities, but also because the private sector does not constitute a cohesive force. Given its absolutely heterogeneous and residual character, its possibilities for, quote, challenging, end quote, state domination are non-existent. The problems of an advanced industrial society like the USSR cannot be resolved through the development of production for direct consumption, small-scale artisan production, or the black market. A challenge to the plan-dominated economy cannot be launched from these sectors. In fact, some of these residues exist only because of dysfunctions in the planned economy, e.g. the black market, and would disappear if the plan was to be replaced by the market or by socialist production. If there are very serious problems in the Soviet economy, they must be located within its leading sector, i.e. within the framework of state industries integrated into the plan, and the fundamental dysfunctions of the Soviet economy are not dysfunctions typical of a capitalist economy. Mercantile residues are largely irrelevant. Thus, the monetary system, surviving for reasons cited earlier, has taken on new functions within the new economy. Small-scale kolkhoz production is tolerated since it permits the kolkhoz people to make ends meet and reconstitute the necessary labor power for the system in face of inadequate and meager salaries. Housing production for self-consumption serves to alleviate some social tensions since the state prefers to concentrate its resources elsewhere, i.e. in the development of heavy industry. And lastly, dealing in the black market and illegal speculation arise inevitably when there is a consistent shortage of consumer goods, a phenomenon unheard of in other advanced countries except under unusual circumstances such as war. The same is true with prices. They have largely a bookkeeping and calculating function. Prices in the state-agricultural relationship reimburse part of the costs of production necessary for the kolkhoz to reconstitute its productive stock and to perpetuate its function within the plan, and prices obtaining in the relationship between consumers and the state also operate within the logic of the plan, which is radically different from that of capitalism. Even interest in Russia are not similar to the capitalist notion of interests. First of all, since interests can also be found in pre-capitalist societies, they do not necessarily imply the existence of profit-oriented production. In the USSR, the interest rate in the early years was about 5 to 6%. In October of 1934, it increased to 8 to 9% for individual deposits, 6% for the kolkhoz deposits, and 3% for those of other concerns. After 1936, this rate stabilized itself at 3% for individual and kolkhoz deposits and at 1% for those of other concerns. Clearly, interest rates are used to round up individual savings in order to provide enterprises with the cash necessary to pay workers' wages in cash. The whole operation is once again connected with a productive system that operates according to the plan in which mercantile and profit parameters are non-existent or secondary. The same applies to those enterprises which have ready cash in hand, which, however, cannot be readily obtained with the usual dull and heavy administrative methods. Thus, interest functions as an incentive for the various concerns to deposit their savings. The state, however, by paying interest to its concerns, merely redistributes wealth within the framework of its own property. The converse is also true. The state receives interest for its credits from the kolkhoz, 1.75% until 1961 and 0.75% after. Financial credits have a rate of 1 or 2%. The state receives income from a concern which, in spite of formal appearances, already belongs to the state. Given this kind of situation, banks have functions and duties that are quite different from those of Western banks. Not only do they handle funds in a different manner, but they function as administrative entities and not as speculative mercantile enterprises. Financing is a function of the dictates of the plan, and not of market stimulations. On the whole, banks are mainly controlling agencies for state enterprise, though through its bookkeeping functions and productivity checks. Section 11. State property in the USSR. Recent debates concerning East European legal structures throw further light on the nature of state property. No one denies that in Russia and in Eastern European countries, Yugoslavia excepted, there is real state ownership of the Soviet enterprises, including the collective farms. Yet, even in the Stalin era, a Soviet jurist, Vened Ichtov, coined the term and concept of, quote, law of operative administration, end quote, to indicate the enterprise's autonomous right over the goods entrusted to them. I just wanted to read this, a quick thing. Okay, I don't seem to be finding anything for this Veniktov. I'm not even sure I'm saying his name right. Venediktov. But earlier I was trying to find something about wage reform in the Soviet Union, and I found it. According to Wikipedia, the Wikipedia article titled Wage Reform in the Soviet Union 1956 to 1962, we read, quote, during the Khrushchev era, especially from 1956 through 1962, the Soviet Union attempted to implement major wage reforms intended to move Soviet industrial workers away from the mindset of overfulfilling quotas that had characterized the Soviet economy during the preceding Stalinist period, and toward a more efficient financial incentive. Throughout the Stalinist period, most Soviet workers had been paid for their work based on a piece rate system. Thus, their individual wages were directly tied to the amount of work they produced. This policy was intended to encourage workers to toil and therefore increase production as much as possible. The piece rate system led to the growth of bureaucracy and contributed to significant inefficiencies in Soviet industry. In addition, factory managers frequently manipulated the personal production quotas given to workers to prevent workers' wages from falling too low. The wage reform sought to remove these wage practices and offer an efficient financial incentive to Soviet workers by standardizing wages and reducing the dependence on overtime or bonus payments. However, industrial managers were often unwilling to take actions that would effectively reduce workers' wages and frequently ignored the directives they were given, continuing to pay workers high overtime rates. Industrial materials were frequently in short supply, and production needed to be carried out as quickly as possible once materials were available, a practice known as, quote, storming, end quote. The prevalence of storming meant that the ability to offer bonus payments was vital to the everyday operation of Soviet industry, and as a result, the reforms ultimately failed to create a more efficient system. Back to the text. It should be remembered, footnote. Si Venediktov la proprietà socialista dello Stato, published in Turin in 1953. For a wide range of Russian judicial theories concerning economic law, see Cerrone, Il pensiero giuridico sovietico, published in 1969, and Villari, le forme organizzative nel diritto sovietico. I don't know why I'm reading these. Sorry, I'm just like on autopilot. There's no sense me reading the titles of those books. Anyway, end footnote. It should be remembered that the term, quote, right, end quote, usually indicates a power granted for realizing one's own independent interest. Thus, it is clear that such a conception tends to protect the interests of the enterprise against those of the state boss. If, however, the term, quote, right of operative management, end quote, referred to the power of the enterprise to dispose of its goods within the limits of the plan and its goals, then we should have to talk of a power of management in the higher interest of the state granted for realizing the goals of the plan. Actually, even though it maintained a rigid control over the productive apparatus, the state could not decide all the details a priori. A certain autonomy had to be left to the managers of the enterprises. This, quote, executive autonomy, end quote, existed even in Stalin's era. Footnote. On this see Geschichtenkron, Economic Backwardness in Historical Perspective, published in 1962, and Ronstein, Profila dell'Economia Sovietica, who emphasizes the so-called Directors' Fund, often comprising 20% and more of the enterprise's profits. End footnote. This, however, does not conflict with the bureaucracy's ownership and the plan's implementation from above. Even in capitalist enterprises, the board of directors of large corporations cannot decide every detail that each branch must perform. Thus, once basic decisions are made, a certain executive autonomy is left to subordinate functionaries in the branches. Ultimately, however, it is the corporation, i.e. the capitalist shareholders, who determine the general economic activity, who decide the allocation of resources, etc. The branch managers have only a subordinate power that they must exercise in the interest of the corporation. In this respect, the function of Soviet managers is somewhat similar. Both types of managers can only exercise their power in the interest of the owner, i.e. either the Soviet state or the stockholders, in parentheses. From this viewpoint, we cannot talk about enterprises' autonomous rights in the Soviet Union up to 1965, in a system in which the state, through the plan, decides the level and deployment of investment, wages, the level of employment, the quantity and quality of the goods produced, etc. One cannot counterpose the rights of an enterprise over its own goods to that of the state. After all, the state can, among other things, merge, split, close, reorganize, etc. the individual enterprises. This is by no means a situation of double ownership of the state and of the enterprise, but of only one ownership, that of the state. The power of the enterprise, and therefore of the director, the working class does not count for anything in the Soviet system, is limited to that of executive management within the framework of the plan. The debate among the Soviet jurists on this matter has a profound significance, not because of legal but because of social implications. It testifies to the existence of tendencies since the Stalin era seeking to corrode state ownership to the advantage of the individual enterprises. Already in economic debates, Footnote. On this point, see Geschenkron. This debate originated, among other things, in Stalin's polemic Economic Problems of Socialism with Notkin, Sanina, and Venier. The latter tended to emphasize the role of the market, much to Stalin's displeasure. End footnote. Already in the economic debates in 1962, many economists sought to shift the axis of the economy from the state to the firm. The economic discussion is reflected at the legal level in the work of Venediktov and his school. The formal recognition of the administrative rights of the firm occurred in 1961, while Lieberman's polemic developed in 1962. Yet the legal recognition in 1961 of the enterprise's rights to the administrative management over its goods has substantially changed things. After all, this, quote, right, end quote, is defined by Soviet law as the power of the enterprise to utilize its goods, quote, according to the objective of their activity, the duties assigned to it by the plan, and the destination of the goods, end quote. Footnote. See Jeremy's article, Atti del Convegno di Tromezzo. I don't know. A number of interesting positions emerged at the convention that confirm our theory. Thus, the Bulgarian professor Stalev maintained that, quote, the operating administration is more a function than a real right of state enterprise, end quote. Yet a right cannot be equated with an administrative function. Professor Jeremy observed that the question in itself has nominal value. He doubted that it makes any real difference whether the enterprise have a right or a function. What this seems to mean is that the question is not merely a legal one, but concerns power relations between the state and the enterprises. End footnote. Such a legal definition does not recognize any autonomous interest independent of the plan. Clearly, this formal concession to the forces seeking business autonomy is a recognition of their political strength, something confirmed by the extensive legal and economic reforms of 1965 to 66. Footnote. Before the reforms of 1965, the autonomy of the enterprises, with reference to their ability to negotiate contracts among themselves, was almost non-existent. Concerning the innovations of the reform, the Soviet jurist Yofa writes, quote, up until a little while ago, this relation, bracket, between plan and business autonomy, Antonio Carlo, end bracket, was determined by giving priority to the directives of the plan and by setting up subordinate and sequential economic contracts with a fixed and unchangeable schema, end quote. End footnote. After 1965, the situation was slightly modified. Now the enterprise had the right to refuse useless and excessive supplies of goods by giving a 10-day notice to the supplying enterprise. They can also refuse supplies when they are no longer needed to realize the plan. In some cases, the firms can modify the conditions of the contracts when this does not interfere with the realization of the plan. They can also freely sell those products that have not distributed according to the dictates of the plan. These innovations, however, should not be overemphasized. The reform does not challenge the economically dominant position of the plan. Footnote. Even after the 1965 reform, the plan directly determined the production and distribution of approximately 20,000 scarce or vital products. With respect to secondary products, the enterprises could arrange things among themselves through the use of contracts. At present, there is a network of 120 department stores that could distribute 620 products made through free negotiations. One can easily infer the relative importance of the two sectors by comparing the number of goods they produce and distribute. End footnote. Moreover, with the bureaucrats' renewed offensive culminating with the Czech invasion, many of these innovations were rescinded. Here we have had to anticipate a number of the conclusions that will be reached on the basis of a more thorough discussion of the 1965 reforms and the social forces that propelled them. This partial anticipation was necessary in order to establish the state character of Soviet ownership, as opposed to those tendencies that attempt to limit it. These tendencies are not mere legal chatter, they correspond to a definite social reality. Before the 1965 reforms, these tendencies did not have the strength to openly challenge the bureaucracy. Instead, they attempted to corrode the power of the plan and bureaucratic ownership of the more subtle and direct means of legal interpretation. This, however, did not hinder the state from forcing its directives on the enterprises in a totally authoritarian manner. Section 12, Conclusions. The preceding rules out that there was a capitalist system in the USSR from 1928 to 1965. Nevertheless, the USSR does share some characteristics with capitalism. Most important is the dominant role of expanded reproduction, even though in Russia such reproduction does not come about through the laws of the market and the production for surplus value. End production for surplus value. On the contrary, we are confronted with the expanded reproduction of use values instead of exchange values, a situation that indicates a certain resemblance to socialism as hypothesized by Marx. Footnote. See Marx Capital Volume 2, where he speaks of expanded reproduction in a socialist society as a reproduction of use values. We've already noted that the category of use value applies to the secondary sector in the USSR. See Stalin's Economic Problems of Socialism and Mandel's Marxist Economic Theory, Volume 2. Have a rather different understanding of this exchange. They forget that in the USSR, exchange and exchange values are subordinated to the plan and to the production of use values. Thus they assume an importance quite different from that in mercantile economies. Moreover, Stalin and Mandel forget that there can only be commodities where production is carried out by independent economic units. End footnote. Yet the system cannot be called socialist because of the presence of exploitation, which implies the existence of a dominant class appropriating the surplus value of subordinate classes, and because of the alienation of the workers from the productive apparatus. The Soviet system also exhibits certain traits similar to feudalism, i.e. the fusion of political power and control. Of public power and control. Feudalism, however, unlike the Soviet system, was a type of agrarian society based on production for immediate consumption, in which expanded reproduction was transitory and secondary. There was nothing in this society that resembled planned mass industrial production. Thus, the political and economic fusion found in the USSR has rather different roots than those found in feudal societies. Furthermore, in feudalism, although political and economic powers are fused, they are also atomized. This corresponds to the fragmentation of the feudal world into various self-contained and political economic units, the fiefs. Footnote. On this, see Marx, Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations, published in 1964, Bloch, Feudal Society, published in 1961, and Brentano, Le origini del capitalismo, Florence, 1954. End footnote. In contrast, the Soviet Union reveals a high degree of centralization. For these reasons, we must reject recent attempts to compare the USSR to a, quote, feudal system, end quote. Footnote. See Rizzi, Il collectivismo, who compares the USSR to ancient Sparta. The same criticism applies to Wittfogel. I think that's a kind of a confused, just as a side note, I think from what I know of Wittfogel and what I know of his comparison between the Soviet Union and Asiatic modes of production, or so-called hydraulic modes of production, is that there's a difference between feudalism broadly conceived in different parts of the world. In Europe, which most Europeans usually think of as feudalism par excellence, was rather decentralized. But that I don't believe that was the case in the type of hydraulic societies that at least Wittfogel is referring to. I cannot speak on what Bruno Rizzi's analogy to feudal societies. Back to the text. The USSR is a class society that partly resembles other class societies. In certain respects, however, it appears to resemble socialism, but these similarities are very superficial. The USSR is neither socialist nor capitalist, nor does it exhibit the feudal or Asiatic mode of production. It is a new antagonistic system with its own specific dynamic in which elements similar to other systems acquire a new function. From this viewpoint, it is inappropriate to refer to the Soviet Union as a transitional society understood as a society in which the proletariat has seized power and implements a conscious plan of socialist transformation. Following Rizzi, we will call the Soviet system, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, to characterize it as a system dominated by the collective property of a central political class bureaucracy. Footnote. The central bureaucracy refers to a leading elite in the state party. As for the internal organization of this class, Karan and Mojlevsky write, quote, membership in the central political bureaucracy implies effective participation in the elaboration of the political and economic decisions fundamental to national development. It is practically impossible to express in precise numbers the extent of this elite. Even an approximate evaluation would necessitate politically impossible sociological studies. At any rate, what is most important is to know not so much the internal organization of the bureaucracy, but its function in a society and in the process of social production, end quote. There is no doubt that major political and economic decisions are made independent of the wishes of the great masses of people. Such decisions are monopolized by a restricted elite whose upper echelon is clearly visible, the leaders and higher functionaries of the party state, as well as the upper levels of the military hierarchy, who were originally closely interconnected with the ruling apparatus. Zhukov, Voroshilov, Bulganin, and for a time, Gretko. Concerning the police apparatus, Bienkovsky, in Bureaucratic et Potere Socialista, maintains that it suffocates the political apparatus as exemplified by the Stalinist experience. Stalin, however, was a politician who made use of the police for political ends and eventually physically eliminated the heads of this police apparatus, Yagoda, Yzhov Dzerzhinsky, Minyusky, and Beria, etc. From an economic and structural viewpoint, this does not mean that the interests of the police are incompatible with and independent of those of the political apparatus. In its leading circles, the police constitute a fraction of the dominant bureaucracy. Okay, so that's the end of part 1 of this essay. Part 2 is titled Bureaucratic Collectivism. Thank you so much for listening.